My name is Blair. I am 33 years old, and until recently, my family considered me the ultimate disappointment. I am a former military police officer who now runs a private corporate security firm in Chicago. Last month, my twin sister showed up at my high security apartment at 2 in the morning. She was covered in bruises, her ribs shattered by her billionaire husband. When she told me the local police were on his payroll, I did not cry. I simply cut off my hair, dyed it to match hers, and took her place in his mansion to teach him a lesson he will never forget. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe abusers should always get exactly what they deserve. The security perimeter of my downtown Chicago penthouse does not breach easily. I designed the systems myself, so when the heavy reinforced oak door buzzed with an emergency override code at 2 in the morning, my military instincts kicked in instantly. I grabbed the tactical flashlight from my nightstand and moved silently through the dark hallway. I expected a threat. I did not expect to find my own face looking back at me battered and completely unrecognizable. It was Brianna, my identical twin sister. She collapsed across the threshold the moment I disengaged the deadbolts. The metallic scent of fresh blood hit the air before she even hit the floor. I caught her just in time, my arms wrapping around a body that felt impossibly fragile and broken. Her designer silk dress, a piece that probably cost more than my first car, was soaked in crimson. I shifted immediately into triage mode, falling back on years of combat medic cross-training from my time in the service. I carried her to the living room rug, ignoring the blood staining the white wool. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. I carefully unzipped the side of her dress to assess the damage. Dark, angry purple mottling covered her left rib cage. By the unnatural shift of her breathing, I could tell she had at least 3 fractured ribs. Her left eye was swollen shut, and the skin around her cheekbone was split open. I grabbed my trauma kit from the hall closet and began packing the laceration on her forehead. Brianna gripped my wrist with terrifying desperation. Her fingers were trembling so violently, I could feel the vibrations traveling up my arm. "He did this," she gasped out, choking on her own breath. "Kendrick." I stopped moving for a fraction of a second. Kendrick. Her husband. The man my mother practically worshipped. The wealthy, charismatic hedge fund manager who was supposedly the shining example of African American excellence in Chicago society. "I am calling the authorities," I said, firmly reaching for my encrypted phone. "I will have units from the State Division here in 5 minutes." Brianna panicked, trying to sit up and crying out in agony as her broken ribs shifted. She gripped my shirt so hard her knuckles turned white. "I tried," she sobbed. I ran to the local precinct first. The desk sergeant called him right in front of me. "Kendrick funds their police union pension. He bought them all new cruisers last year. The chief is his golf partner. They were going to drive me right back to his estate. I barely managed to slip out the back and hail a cab. If you call them, they will just hand me back to him." Before I could process the absolute corruption she had just described, my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the coffee table. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim room. It was Linda, our mother. I stared at the screen, then down at my twin sister bleeding on my floor. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone, tossing it onto the table while I continued taping a pressure dressing to Brianna's ribs. "Blair!" My mother snapped immediately, her voice loud and grating. "Do you have any idea how embarrassing you are?" I did not say a word. I just kept wrapping medical tape around my sister's torso. "You deliberately skipped Kendrick's birthday gala tonight." Linda continued, oblivious to the heavy silence on my end. "Do you know who was there? The mayor, 3 state senators, dozens of venture capitalists. Kendrick is a titan in this city. He is the absolute pinnacle of an elite African American businessman, an incredible provider, and he throws a party that costs more than your entire company makes in a year, and you could not even bother to show up to support your own family." I wiped a smear of blood off Brianna's cheek with a sterile gauze pad. Brianna squeezed her eyes shut, silent tears leaking out as she listened to our mother praise the monster who had just shattered her bones. You are 33 years old, Blair, Linda scoffed. You dress like a mercenary. You spend all your time with guns and security codes. You have absolutely no idea how to treat a man, how to be soft, or how to actually please someone. You should really take notes from your sister. Brianna knows how to keep a powerful man happy. She knows her role. She is living a life of absolute luxury because she knows how to be a real woman. I had to apologize to Kendrick tonight and tell him you were busy playing soldier somewhere. My vision tunneled. A cold, absolute rage settled over my heart, freezing the blood in my veins. I looked at my sister, the so-called real woman, who knew her role, currently coughing up blood onto my expensive rug because her perfect provider had nearly beaten her to death. Are you even listening to me? Linda demanded through the speaker. You are a massive disappointment, Blair. You always have been. Try to act like you belong in polite society for once in your life. I reached out and ended the call without saying a single word. The room fell dead silent, save for the ragged, painful wheezing coming from my twin's chest. My hands were no longer shaking. The medic in me stepped back and the tactical commander took over. Our mother was right about one thing. I did know about guns and security codes and warfare. I knew exactly how to dismantle an enemy infrastructure piece by piece. I brushed the blood-soaked hair out of Brianna's face. You are safe now, I promised her, my voice dropping to a deadly, icy whisper. I am going to get you out of this city tonight. And then I am going to show your perfect husband exactly what a disappointment looks like. I bypassed the standard emergency rooms entirely. Taking a battered woman into a Chicago hospital triggers an automatic police report, and as Brianna had painfully discovered tonight, the local precinct belonged entirely to her husband. Instead, I drove her to a discreet private trauma clinic run by an old combat surgeon who owed me his life from our deployment days overseas. He asked 0 questions, stabilized her shattered ribs, and administered enough painkillers to finally let her sleep in the secure recovery room. An hour later, the heavy metal door of the clinic back office swung open. Declan stepped inside, shaking the autumn rain from his dark wool coat. Declan was my chief intelligence officer and a former military judge advocate general. He possessed a mind like a steel trap and a total lack of patience for civilian bureaucracy. He dropped a thick manila folder onto the stainless steel table between us, his jaw locked tight with suppressed anger. It is worse than we thought, Declan said, his voice a low and hard rumble in the quiet room. I pulled the data logs from the suburban estate grid. Kendrick wiped the entire internal and external security server at exactly 1 in the morning. He initiated a catastrophic overwrite and categorized it to the security provider as a routine firmware update glitch. There is absolutely no video evidence of what he did to your sister in that house tonight. I crossed my arms, feeling the familiar and cold surge of adrenaline flooding my system. A billionaire hedge fund manager suddenly experiences a total system failure on the exact night he beats his wife half to death. Very convenient. What about the local police logs? Declan opened the folder, spreading out several printed documents under the harsh fluorescent light. Scrubbed completely clean. The desk sergeant Brianna spoke to did not file a domestic violence incident report. He logged her arrival as a wellness check for a distressed and confused individual. Kendrick has been funneling millions of dollars into their police union through his philanthropic foundation for years. To the local authorities, he is a saint. To the justice system, Brianna is just an ungrateful, hysterical housewife, making up wild stories to ruin a prominent African-American businessman. We can fight that in a higher court, I said, my mind already calculating tactical angles and legal maneuvers. We take it federal. We pull his financial leverage into the light and force a federal inquiry. Declan shook his head, pushing a specific red-flagged document toward me. We do not have time for a federal escalation, Blair. Look at this. Kendrick is not just covering his tracks. He is actively hunting her down, and he is using the family court system as his weapon of choice. I scanned the heavily redacted legal filing. The words blurred together for a fraction of a second before the sheer terrifying reality of his plan crystallized in my mind. It was an emergency ex parte motion for temporary sole custody of their 4-year-old son, Leo. but the justification attached to the motion was what made my blood run ice cold. Kendrick had retained one of the most ruthless and expensive family law firms in the state of Illinois. Attached to the motion was a preliminary medical evaluation signed by a highly paid boutique psychiatrist who regularly consulted for his hedge fund. He is claiming she had a psychotic break, Declan explained, pointing to the highlighted paragraphs on the page. The narrative he is spinning to the judge is that Brianna has been secretly suffering from severe paranoid schizophrenia. He claims she injured herself in a violent manic episode last night, smashed up the house, and fled into the city in a state of dangerous delirium. My hands gripped the edges of the metal table until my knuckles turned white. He is setting up an involuntary psychiatric hold. Exactly, Declan confirmed grimly. He has a private ambulance on standby and a bed reserved at a luxury psychiatric facility upstate. The facility director is another one of his wealthy country club buddies. If Brianna sets foot in a standard hospital, or if she walks into a police station to report the abuse, they will flag her name in the system. She will be immediately detained under the Mental Health Act, heavily medicated against her will, and locked in a padded room. I stared at the documents, the absolute malice of his strategy washing over me. Kendrick was not just trying to avoid jail time for domestic battery. He was going to bury my twin sister alive in a psychiatric ward, strip her of her maternal rights, and keep his pristine public image completely intact. If she fought back, she would look crazy. If she cried and screamed for help, she would look unstable. If she showed them her bruised and broken ribs, they would nod sympathetically and document it as self-inflicted trauma caused by a schizophrenic episode. He had flawlessly weaponized the entire legal and medical infrastructure against a battered woman. Normal law could not touch him now. The door behind us clicked open. Brianna stood leaning against the doorframe, clutching a thin medical gown around her tightly wrapped chest. The heavy painkillers could not mask the absolute terror in her swollen and purple eyes. She had heard everything we just said. "He is going to take Leo," she whispered, her voice breaking into a dry, agonizing sob. "He always told me he could do it. He said he owned the judges. He said no one would ever believe me over a man who funds their election campaigns." I walked over to her quickly, carefully placing my hands on her trembling shoulders to steady her. "He is not taking your son. I will not let that happen. That. You do not understand Blair," she cried softly, leaning her forehead against my shoulder. "You cannot fight him with lawyers or logic. He has unlimited money. He has the entire system rigged from top to bottom. If I show my face anywhere in this city, I lose my baby forever. I have to go back. I have to go back to that house and beg him to forgive me, or I will never see Leo again." Hearing my gentle, sweet sister talk about returning to a man who had nearly killed her just to protect her child ignited a completely different kind of fire inside me. Conventional warfare was officially off the table. A direct legal assault would be a slaughter. Kendrick had built a fortress of wealth, corruption, and influence that could not be breached from the outside. Declan watched me intently. He knew that specific look on my face. We had served together in active war zones overseas, and he had seen me wear that exact expression right before I ordered a devastating covert strike. "Blair," Declan cautioned, stepping forward with his hands raised slightly. "The law cannot touch him right now. Any aggressive move we make will simply validate his fake story about her being violent and unstable. We are boxed in completely. It is a perfect trap." I turned away from Brianna and looked at the reflection of us in the dark glass of the clinic window. We were identical twins. We shared the exact same face, the same height, the same voice. But that was where the similarities ended. Brianna was raised by our mother to be a soft, compliant society wife who smiled for the cameras. I was trained by the United States military to dismantle hostile targets by any means necessary. "You are right, Declan," I said, my voice dropping to a dead and mechanical calm. "The law cannot touch him. A lawyer cannot touch him. And Brianna certainly cannot touch him." I turned back to the table, picking up the emergency psychiatric hold document and slowly tearing it perfectly in half. "But he thinks he broke his wife tonight." I continued staring at the shredded paper fluttering to the floor. "He thinks she is weak, terrified, and backed into a corner with no way out. He expects a broken woman to come crawling back to his mansion to beg for her child. He is expecting Brianna. I looked at my sister, gently wiping a stray tear from her uninjured cheek. He is not expecting me. I turned to Declan, my mind already executing a flawless tactical pivot. I pointed to the heavy black canvas bag resting by his feet. I need your emergency extraction kit from the trunk. I commanded, my voice devoid of any emotion. The one with the trauma shears and the burner communication devices. Declan stared at me for a split second before a grim, hardened understanding settled over his features. We had served in enough hostile territories together for him to read my strategies before I even fully articulated them. "You are going to take her place," he stated, not asking a question, but confirming a reality. "It is the only tactical advantage we possess right now," I said, already unbuttoning my dark tactical jacket and tossing it onto a nearby medical cart. "Kendrick has completely insulated himself against Brianna. He has built a legal, financial, and social fortress, specifically designed to keep a terrified, dependent housewife from escaping his control. He expects her to be paralyzed by fear. He has absolutely zero defenses prepared for an infiltration." Brianna gasped from the recovery bed, instinctively clutching her shattered ribs. "Blair, no," she pleaded, her voice trembling with genuine terror. "You do not know him behind closed doors. He is a monster. He is too strong. He will kill you if he finds out you are not me. He is a coward with a massive checkbook and a severe god complex." I corrected her, keeping my gaze steady and intensely focused. "And he is about to find out exactly what happens when you lock a highly trained apex predator inside your luxury cage." Declan returned a moment later and unzipped the black canvas bag on the stainless steel table. I walked over to the small sink in the corner of the clinic room and looked at my reflection. Brianna had always maintained her hair in soft, flowing chestnut waves, a deliberate and stark contrast to my harsh military regulation blonde crop. I reached into Declan's bag and pulled out a box of dark hazelnut chemical hair dye, a standard protocol item for field agents who required an immediate physical alteration to evade hostile tracking. I handed Declan the heavy trauma shears. "Cut it right now," I instructed. "Match her exact length. Make the ends look jagged and uneven, like he violently pulled it out by the roots during the struggle tonight." Declan did not hesitate. He sheared away my blonde hair in thick chunks until it fell to the sterile linoleum floor. I rapidly mixed the chemical dye and worked it into my scalp with clinical aggressive precision, ignoring the harsh burning sensation against my skin. While the color set effectively erasing my identity and replacing it with hers, I turned my attention back to my bleeding twin. "Take off the dress," I told her. Brianna wept silently as the clinic nurse gently helped her out of the ruined designer silk. The expensive fabric was incredibly heavy, saturated entirely with her own blood. When I finally pulled it over my own head, the cold, wet sensation of my sister's trauma clinging to my bare skin made my stomach drop. It smelled overwhelmingly like high-end floral perfume and metallic copper. I did not flinch. Instead, I let that sickening scent fuel the absolute cold-blooded rage burning deep in my chest. I looked in the mirror one last time. With the chestnut hair drying into soft, messy waves and the torn, bloodied silk clinging perfectly to my frame, the optical illusion was completely flawless. I was no longer Blair, the hardened security CEO and former military police officer. I was Brianna, the broken, battered, and defeated trophy wife. "I need his schedule," I said, crouching down next to Brianna so she could hear me clearly. "I need the gate codes, the alarm frequencies, and the exact location of the server room in that house." She swallowed hard, terrified by how perfectly I mirrored her nightmare. "The main gate code is his birth year, followed by our son's birth month," she whispered shakily. "The house alarm deactivates with my fingerprint, but he always overrides it from his master control tablet when he is angry. The security servers are in the basement, hidden behind a biometric lock in his private office. Leo is asleep with the live-in nanny in the east wing. Kendrick never goes to that side of the house after midnight because he hates the noise." "Good," I replied, memorizing the architectural layout in my mind. "That keeps my nephew out of the crossfire." I stood up and faced Declan. "You keep her secured in this clinic. Total blackout protocol is in effect. No digital footprint, no credit card usage, no civilian medical records filed. If anyone asks, she does not exist on this planet. You monitor my encrypted radio signal. If it drops for more than 60 seconds, you do not call the local police. You call our federal contacts and you breach that estate with a full tactical assault team. Understood. Declan said, his jaw locked tight. Give him hell, Blair. I am going to give him something much worse, I promised. I walked out into the freezing Chicago rain, the frigid air biting at my bare arms. Brianna's keys felt foreign in my hand, but I easily located her silver Porsche parked discreetly in the dark alleyway where she had abandoned it earlier. I slid into the driver's seat. The beige leather interior was heavily stained with dark smears, a grim and violent reminder of her desperate flight. I gripped the leather steering wheel, intentionally smudging the dried blood across my own knuckles to complete the physical narrative of a helpless victim. The drive to the northern suburbs took exactly 42 minutes. The torrential rain lashed against the windshield, washing away the bright city lights and replacing them with the sprawling, isolated darkness of the ultra-wealthy estates. Kendrick's sprawling property sat menacingly at the end of a private cul-de-sac, surrounded by 10-foot wrought iron gates and manicured hedges designed to hide his domestic terror from the main road. It was a fortress built on fraudulent money and absolute control. I pulled the Porsche up to the glowing security keypad. I punched in the numbers Brianna had given me. The heavy iron gates swung open smoothly, welcoming the prey back into the slaughterhouse. I drove up the winding cobblestone driveway and parked haphazardly near the massive front steps, leaving the vehicle slightly angled to perfectly mimic the panicked state of a woman who had finally given up running. I stepped out into the relentless downpour, letting the freezing rain soak my newly dyed hair and plaster the ruined silk dress to my body. I needed to look utterly defeated. I needed to look like a woman who had realized the local police were bought, the legal system was rigged, and her only option left on earth was to crawl back to her abuser to protect her child. I shivered violently, hunching my shoulders and perfectly adopting Brianna's physical posture of submission and profound fear. I walked slowly up the sweeping marble steps and pushed open the heavy mahogany front door. It was unlocked. He was waiting for me. The grand foyer was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long and menacing across the imported Italian marble floor. The sheer scale of the house was suffocating. I took a slow, trembling step forward, letting my bare feet slap wetly against the cold stone. He was sitting dead center in the sunken living room, illuminated only by the faint flickering glow of the modern gas fireplace. Kendrick lounged on the white leather sofa, one leg crossed casually over his knee, projecting an aura of absolute dominance. A crystal glass of amber bourbon sat untouched on the expensive side table. In his right hand, he held a thick, heavy leather belt. The solid brass buckle glinted sharply in the low light. He was rhythmically tapping the heavy leather against his open palm, creating a slow, terrifying metronome in the dead silence of the house. He did not even bother to stand up when he saw my bleeding figure in the doorway. He simply tilted his head, his handsome, perfectly sculpted features twisting into a mask of pure, arrogant cruelty. "You dare crawl back, you whore?" Kendrick snarled, his voice a low, lethal rumble that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. I stopped walking immediately. I dropped my chin to my chest, letting the wet, dark hair fall forward to obscure my face entirely. I let my shoulders shake, giving him the exact illusion of a broken spirit he was craving. I kept my head bowed, hiding the cold, predatory smile spreading across my lips. The stage was set. The doors were locked. The Trojan horse was safely inside the city walls. Kendrick stood up from the white leather sofa. He did not rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate arrogance of a man who owned the city and everyone inside it. The heavy leather belt swung rhythmically against his tailored slacks. He walked toward me, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking softly against the polished marble floor. He was savoring this moment. In his mind, he had already won. He had manipulated the police, secured the legal documents to take his son, and forced his terrified wife to walk back into her own prison. Did you really think you could run from me? He asked, his voice a smooth, venomous purr. Did you think some minimum wage desk sergeant was going to protect you? I own them. I own this house. I own your entire pathetic life. I kept my head bowed, letting my wet dye-soaked hair shield my eyes. My shoulders shook, mimicking profound terror, but my internal heart rate remained at a steady, calm 60 beats per minute. I was actively cataloging his physical geometry. He was 6'2", weighing perhaps 210 pounds. He had the broad, muscular build of a man who paid a luxury personal trainer to make him look intimidating in a custom suit. But his footwork was sloppy. He walked flat-footed, his weight entirely unbalanced, completely exposed. To an abuser, a cowering victim is just a static target. To a combat veteran, an arrogant, untrained man closing the distance is moving in slow motion. You are going to learn your place tonight. He sneered, stopping less than 2 feet away from me. He raised his left hand, his fingers outstretched, lunging forward to violently tangle his grip in my wet hair. That was the trigger. I did not think. Muscle memory takes over when you have spent a decade training for close-quarters combat in hostile environments. As his hand shot forward, I moved. I did not retreat or cower. I stepped directly into his personal space, instantly cutting off his leverage and blinding his peripheral vision. My left hand shot upward, the rigid heel of my palm striking the delicate nerve cluster on the inside of his forearm. The impact was precise and devastating. His fingers went completely numb before they could even brush my hair. Before his arrogant brain could register the block, my right hand secured his thick wrist like a steel vise. I pivoted on my heel, using his own forward momentum against him. I twisted his arm outward, locking his elbow in a rigid, inescapable bind, and isolated his right index finger. I applied a calculated, merciless fraction of torque. A loud, sharp crack echoed fiercely through the cavernous marble foyer. It sounded exactly like a thick, dry branch snapping in half under a heavy combat boot. Kendrick let out a raw, guttural shriek. It was not the sound of a powerful, untouchable hedge fund titan. It was the high-pitched, ragged scream of a pampered bully experiencing genuine, excruciating physical agony for the very first time in his privileged life. The heavy leather belt clattered uselessly to the floor. He stumbled backward, his face instantly draining of all color, his eyes wide with blinding shock. He cradled his mangled hand tightly against his chest, staring at his index finger, which was now bent backward at a grotesque, highly unnatural angle. I had exactly 2 seconds to sell the illusion. If I stood there with the cold, lethal posture of a trained military operative, my cover was instantly blown. He would know immediately that I was not Brianna. I snapped the trap shut. I let out a piercing, hysterical shriek that matched his own. I threw both my hands over my mouth, my eyes wide with manufactured, wide-eyed horror. I scrambled frantically backward like a cornered prey animal, my bare feet slipping clumsily on the wet marble until my spine slammed hard against the heavy mahogany front door. I slid down to the floor, pulling my knees tight to my chest, and began to sob uncontrollably, gasping for air. "Oh my God," I wailed, letting my voice crack and pitch upward into a flawless imitation of my sister's absolute panic. "Oh my God, Kendrick, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. Please do not hurt me. Please." Kendrick was gasping for air, swaying on his feet. He looked at his dislocated finger, his face contorted with agony, and then stared down at me. His eyes were wild, dilated with shock and a furious, disoriented rage. "You broke my finger!" he roared, his perfectly tailored suit jacket heaving with his erratic breaths. "You crazy bitch! You broke my hand!" I shrank further away from him, shaking my head frantically. Tears streamed down my cheeks in heavy rivers, mixing with the rainwater, and the fake blood smeared across my skin. "I did not mean to," I sobbed, hyperventilating for maximum dramatic effect. "I swear I did not mean to. I saw a video. I saw a women's self-defense video on the internet last week. The lady in the video said to just grab the finger and twist as hard as you can. You scared me so much and I just panicked. I just closed my eyes and twisted. I am so sorry. I buried my face in my hands, weeping loudly, letting my shoulders heave with fake racking sobs. I watched his face closely through the gaps in my fingers. The extreme cognitive dissonance was actively short-circuiting his brain. He was looking at a woman who was currently cowering on the floor, weeping pathetically and begging for mercy. He simply could not reconcile the lethal lightning-fast joint lock he had just experienced with the hysterical broken mess crying at his expensive Italian shoes. His massive, fragile ego provided the exact escape route I knew it would. His narcissism simply would not allow him to believe that his weak, submissive trophy wife had bested him in physical combat. He immediately rationalized the entire event to protect his own pride. It was a fluke. A lucky, desperate spasm of a terrified animal who had watched a stupid social media tutorial. "You psychotic, ungrateful liability," he hissed, his voice trembling with pain as he cradled his swollen purple hand. He kicked the leather belt away entirely, abandoning his plan to beat me. The physical pain had completely drained his appetite for violence. He backed away toward the grand staircase, his face shining with cold sweat. "You are losing your mind. You really are completely insane." I stayed huddled on the floor, maintaining my steady stream of pathetic apologies, watching him retreat. The first strike was a total success. I had physically disabled his dominant hand, shattered his immediate sense of control, and maintained my cover perfectly. The monster was bleeding, and he had absolutely no idea that the prey he thought he trapped was actually the predator locking the cage from the inside. Kendrick vanished up the sweeping grand staircase, his heavy footsteps echoing furiously against the vaulted ceilings. I remained crumpled on the freezing marble floor of the foyer, maintaining my pathetic posture. I listened to the distant sound of doors slamming in his private wing. He was likely searching for ice and a splint for his mangled finger. I used those precious few minutes to regulate my breathing, dropping my heart rate back to a resting baseline. I wiped a mixture of fake tears and rain from my jaw. 10 minutes later, the unmistakable glow of a digital tablet illuminated the upper landing. Kendrick emerged from the shadows. He had hastily wrapped his dislocated finger in white medical tape, holding his injured hand stiffly against his chest. In his left hand, he gripped his master control tablet. His face was a terrifying mask of bruised ego and calculated cruelty. The physical pain had sobered him, replacing his explosive, violent rage with a much colder, more familiar form of psychological warfare. He could not beat me tonight without risking further injury to his dominant hand, so he pivoted to the weapon he trusted most: financial annihilation. A sharp, synchronized electronic thud suddenly echoed through the massive estate. The sound was distinct, heavy, and absolute. It was the sound of titanium deadbolts engaging on every single exterior door. The steel security shutters on the floor-to-ceiling windows slid down with a mechanical whir, sealing the house tight. Kendrick looked down at me from the top of the stairs, his eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. "You really thought a lucky twist of my wrist gave you power?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think physical defiance changes the reality of your pathetic existence? You have absolutely nothing without me." He tapped the glowing screen of his tablet with his uninjured thumb. "I just deactivated your primary black card," he announced smoothly. "And your secondary platinum account. I am wiping your Apple Pay right now. Every single cent you possess exists because I allow it to exist." I forced a loud, panicked gasp, scrambling slightly backward on the floor. I looked up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Please," I begged, letting my voice waver perfectly. "Please do not do this. I have to buy things for Leo. I need my car." "You are not driving anywhere," he snapped, tapping another sequence on the screen. "The biometric scanners on the garage doors are now locked. The perimeter gate codes are changed. You are not leaving this property. You are a prisoner in the luxury cage I bought for you." He leaned against the marble balustrade, relishing my manufactured despair. It was sickeningly clear how often he had used this exact tactic to crush my sister. Through his arrogant monologue, he laid out the entire blueprint of her 5-year domestic imprisonment. "You forget where you came from," he lectured, his tone mocking and vile. "5 years ago, you were nothing. I took you out of that mediocre life. I told you to quit your career because my wife does not need to work for a paycheck. I told you to cut off those pathetic, low-class friends of yours because I provided you with a circle of billionaires and socialites. I dressed you in silk. I put diamonds on your neck. I gave you a child who will inherit a financial empire. And this is how you repay me, by acting like a feral street animal in my foyer." I kept my head bowed, hiding the lethal focus in my eyes. His words painted a crystal-clear picture of how systematic his abuse had been. He had stripped Brianna of her independent income, her career ambitions, and her entire support system, leaving her utterly dependent on his mood swings. He had isolated her so thoroughly that a frozen bank account was effectively a death sentence. "Without my money, you are a zero," Kendrick continued, his voice echoing harshly around the cold walls. "You do not exist in this city without my name attached to you. If you walk out that door, you have no credit history. You have no resume. You have no friends who will risk crossing me to hide you. You will be on the street, and I will have a judge grant me sole custody of Leo before noon tomorrow." I let out a ragged sob, wrapping my arms tightly around my knees. "I know," I cried softly. "I know I am nothing. Please, I will be good. I promise I will be good." It disgusted me to speak the words my sister must have spoken 100 times before. But the performance was flawless. Kendrick soaked up the submission like a dying man finding water. His bruised ego was instantly repaired by the sight of his wife completely broken and begging for financial mercy. "The nanny will take care of Leo tomorrow," Kendrick decreed, turning his back on me. "You are confined to the main house. The alarm will trigger an armed response if you try to open a window. You sit in the dark and you think very carefully about how you are going to beg for my forgiveness when I get home from the office." He tapped one final command on his tablet. Immediately, the grand chandeliers above me powered down. The ambient lighting in the hallways faded to pitch black. He had plunged the entire main floor into darkness, leaving me shivering on the marble in the freezing shadows. Kendrick disappeared down the hallway toward his private wing, confident that he had firmly re-established his absolute dominance. The heavy oak door of his master suite slammed shut in the distance, echoing through the silent mansion. I waited exactly 60 seconds to ensure he was gone. The moment the house settled into total silence, the hysterical weeping housewife vanished entirely. I dropped my hands from my face. I stood up from the freezing marble floor, my movements completely silent, smooth, and precise. I rolled my shoulders back, stretching the tight muscles in my neck. The tears dried instantly on my cheeks. I looked around the pitch-black foyer, my eyes rapidly adjusting to the darkness. Kendrick believed he had just locked a helpless victim inside an impenetrable fortress. He believed taking away her credit cards and changing the door codes rendered her completely powerless. He relied entirely on digital locks and financial abuse to maintain his empire of fear. He had no idea that he had just handed a private security CEO and a former military intelligence officer the exact layout of his defense grid. By bragging about his control systems, he had shown me every single vulnerability in his network. He thought he had cut me off from the world. In reality, he had just locked himself inside a house with his own executioner. I cracked my knuckles in the dark, a cold smile forming on my face. It was time to tear his digital fortress apart from the inside out. At 6 in the morning, the heavy footsteps upstairs signaled Kendrick preparing to leave for the day. I remained on the floor of the master suite walk-in closet where I had spent the night. I shivered on the plush carpet to maintain the illusion of a broken woman too terrified to sleep in a bed. Kendrick opened the closet door. He was dressed in an impeccable charcoal suit, his injured hand heavily wrapped and concealed inside his jacket pocket. He looked down at me with absolute disgust. "The nanny will take Leo to his private preschool," Kendrick dictated coldly. You stay here and think about your complete lack of value. When I get back tonight, I expect a genuine apology on your knees. I kept my head down, forcing a pathetic whimper from my throat. He turned on his heel and walked out. 5 minutes later, I heard the distinctive roar of his customized SUV accelerating down the long driveway. The heavy steel gates clanked shut behind him. The smart house registered his departure, and the perimeter defense grid armed itself with a sharp electronic chime. The moment the house announced it was sealed, I stood up. The cowering victim was completely gone. It was time to go to work. I walked into the massive chef kitchen and grabbed a heavy-duty paring knife. From the hidden compartment in the sole of my combat boot, the ones I had swapped for Brianna's heels in the alleyway, before driving back, I extracted a micro-decryption drive. It was a custom piece of hardware developed by my company's cyber warfare division, something Declan had slipped into my hand at the clinic. It looked like a standard thumb drive, but it possessed enough processing power to crack a bank vault. I moved silently down the hallway toward Kendrick's private office. Brianna had told me the main server rack was hidden in the basement, but the primary access terminal was right here behind a biometric lock. I stood before the sleek frosted glass door of his study. The keypad required a fingerprint and a retinal scan. To a civilian, this is an impenetrable fortress. To a military security specialist, biometrics are just an obstacle course for the unimaginative. I did not need his eyeball or his finger. I just needed the copper wiring hidden behind the wall. I used the heavy handle of the paring knife to smash a small, precise hole in the drywall right next to the scanner panel. I reached into the plaster, pulling out the thick bundle of fiber optic cables connecting the scanner to the magnetic door lock. I stripped the casing away with the sharp blade exposing the raw wires. I twisted the red and green data lines together, creating a manual short circuit that bypassed the biometric verification entirely. The heavy glass door clicked open with a soft sigh of defeated technology. I stepped into his office. The air smelled of expensive cologne and pure arrogance. I bypassed his sleek desktop computer entirely and headed straight for the false wall panel disguised as a custom mahogany bookshelf. I popped the wooden panel open, revealing the humming stack of black servers powering his financial empire and his domestic prison. I plugged the military decryptor directly into the master port. The small LED indicator on the drive pulsed blue, then turned a solid red as it collided with Kendrick's firewall. I pulled out my secure communication device and linked it to the drive. My screen flooded with rapidly scrolling lines of encrypted code. Kendrick paid millions for his cybersecurity, but he bought commercial-grade protection. He was not prepared for a brute force algorithm originally designed by the Department of Defense to infiltrate hostile intelligence networks. 4 minutes and 20 seconds later, the firewall completely collapsed. I had full root access to his entire network. I bypassed the security camera feeds and the smart home controls. I was hunting for the real prize. I drilled down into the hidden partitioned drives where he stored his hedge fund analytics. Kendrick projected the image of a financial genius to the world. He boasted double-digit returns in a volatile market. He actively courted the wealth of the Chicago elite professional athletes and powerful politicians. I opened the master ledger, my eyes scanning the complex spreadsheets. Something was entirely wrong. The math simply did not align with reality. I cross-referenced the incoming investment capital against the actual market trading logs. My breath caught in my throat. There were no trades. There were no offshore development projects or emerging market investments. The entire hedge fund was a massive mirage. Kendrick was running a textbook Ponzi scheme. He was taking millions from new wealthy investors and using that exact cash to pay fake dividends to his older clients. He was printing fraudulent financial statements, fabricating profit margins out of thin air, and skimming an absolute fortune off the top to fund his supercars, his tailored suits, and this $15 million mansion. The man who lectured my sister about her lack of value was nothing but a high-class con artist floating on a fragile bubble of stolen money. But a Ponzi scheme this massive eventually collapses, and Kendrick absolutely knew it. I dug deeper into his encrypted communications folder. I found a heavily guarded subfolder labeled Offshore Contingency. I broke the secondary password and opened the files. The blood drained from my face as I read the digital wire transfer requests. Kendrick was actively liquidating the fund. He had initiated a complex series of shell company transfers designed to quietly drain $200 million of stolen investor capital into an untraceable account in the Cayman Islands. I checked the execution date. The $200 million was scheduled to move automatically at exactly 4 in the afternoon today. I opened the final document in the folder. It was a digital itinerary for a private charter flight departing from a small airfield outside Chicago at 6 this evening. The flight plan was logged for the Caribbean. There were 2 passenger names listed: Kendrick and the name of his mistress. Brianna was not on the manifest. The entire sickening puzzle snapped together in my mind with terrifying clarity. The domestic violence last night was not just a sudden loss of control. It was a highly calculated escalation. The psychotic breakdown narrative, the emergency custody order, the psychiatric hold. Kendrick was completely neutralizing his wife so she could not ask questions or access his accounts when the federal investigators inevitably realized the hedge fund was completely empty. He was going to lock my twin sister in a mental institution, abandon his own son to a team of nannies, steal $200 million from the most powerful people in Chicago, and disappear to a tropical island with another woman. He was leaving Brianna behind to take the absolute ruin, the crushing debt, and the violent public humiliation of the fallout. I stared at the glowing screen, the sheer magnitude of his evil radiating through the quiet server room. He thought he had planned the perfect escape. He thought he had left a broken, terrified woman locked in his house to take the blame for his crimes. I reached out and typed a new command into the terminal overriding his offshore transfer protocol. He wanted to play games with digital money and destroy my bloodline in the process. I was about to show him exactly how a military hacker burns a fraudulent empire to the ashes. I carefully extracted the decryption drive from the server and erased any digital footprint of my intrusion. I secured the mahogany wall panel, leaving his study exactly as I found it. I had planted a dormant Trojan horse deep within his transfer protocol. When 4 o'clock arrived, his $200 million would not bounce to the Cayman Islands. It would reroute to a heavily encrypted federal holding account Declan had prepared completely beyond Kendrick's reach. But I could not trigger the final sequence yet. I needed him to feel invincible for just a few more hours. I needed him surrounded by the very people he was stealing from. Kendrick unlocked the house at exactly 5 in the afternoon. I was sitting on the edge of the master bed staring blankly at the floor. He threw a heavy garment bag onto the mattress beside me. "Get up," he ordered, his voice sharp and utterly devoid of warmth. "We are attending the Chicago Financial Elite Gala tonight. You are going to put on that dress. You are going to apply enough foundation to cover your face. And you are going to stand by my side and look like the perfect, adoring wife." He raised his right hand, displaying a rigid aluminum splint encasing his index finger. He had clearly visited a private physician who asked 0 questions. "I told the doctor you had a hysterical episode and slammed a car door on my hand," Kendrick sneered, stepping closer until his shadow fell over me. "I also told the board members the same story. You are going to smile tonight. You are not going to speak unless a direct question is asked. If you embarrass me, or if you even look at another person the wrong way, I will call the psychiatric transport team before we even reach the driveway. Do you understand me?" "Yes," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on his polished shoes. "I understand." I took the garment bag into the massive master bathroom. Inside was a floor-length emerald green gown. It was stunning, expensive, and designed entirely to show off his wealth. I stood in front of the brightly lit vanity mirror and began the sickening routine my sister must have perfected over the years. I applied heavy, thick layers of color-correcting concealer to my cheekbone and orbital bone, flawlessly masking the simulated bruising I had applied earlier. I watched my reflection transform into the flawless, pristine trophy wife. I was a walking porcelain doll hollowed out and painted over, designed only to reflect his glory. The drive into downtown Chicago was conducted in absolute suffocating silence. Kendrick sat in the back of the chauffeured Maybach, aggressively typing on his good hand, likely finalizing the details of his escape flight to the Caribbean. He did not look at me once. The gala was held in the grand ballroom of a historic downtown hotel. The moment the chauffeur opened the door, flashing cameras illuminated the damp evening air. Kendrick instantly transformed. The cruel, abusive tyrant vanished, replaced seamlessly by the charismatic, brilliant philanthropist. He smiled warmly at the photographers, displaying his white teeth and projecting absolute confidence. He reached out and grabbed my waist. To the outside world, it looked like an affectionate, protective gesture. In reality, his thumb dug painfully into my side, a silent, vicious threat keeping me anchored to his side. We moved through the opulent ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over hundreds of the wealthiest investors, politicians, and socialites in the Midwest. Waiters in crisp black tuxedos circulated with silver trays of champagne. Kendrick navigated the room like a king holding court. He shook hands with his left hand, smoothly offering a charming, self-deprecating joke about his splinted right finger and his clumsy, easily startled wife. I stood there maintaining a soft, vacant smile, nodding at the appropriate intervals. I was actively memorizing the faces of the billionaires and fund managers he was currently bleeding dry. Then I heard the sharp, unmistakable clicking of expensive heels approaching rapidly from behind. "Brianna," a harsh, familiar voice called out. I turned to see Linda, our mother, cutting through the crowd. She looked completely in her element, dripping in diamonds, and wearing a custom gown that Kendrick had undoubtedly paid for. She did not offer a warm greeting or a motherly embrace. Instead, her eyes immediately darted to Kendrick, beaming with absolute adoration, before snapping toward me with cold, hypercritical judgment. "Kendrick, you look incredibly handsome tonight," Linda gushed, touching his arm lightly. "I am so sorry about your hand. Brianna can be so hopelessly careless sometimes. I do not know how you put up with her clumsiness." Kendrick offered my mother a magnanimous, forgiving smile. "We manage Linda. She just needs a firm hand to guide her." "Excuse me, I see the mayor. I need to secure our table." The moment Kendrick stepped away, Linda dropped her polite facade entirely. She grabbed my upper arm, her manicured nails biting into my skin, and practically dragged me away from the main floor into a secluded, dimly lit alcove near the coat check. She shoved me slightly against the silk wallpaper, her eyes blazing with furious indignation. "What is wrong with you tonight?" Linda hissed, keeping her voice low so the passing elite would not hear. "You look like a ghost. You are standing there like a terrified statue. And what is this nonsense about slamming a door on your husband's hand? Are you completely out of your mind?" I kept my head slightly bowed, channeling my sister's typical defensive posture. "I did not mean to," I murmured softly. "It was an accident." He was angry. "I do not care if he was angry," Linda interrupted sharply, stepping into my personal space. "Listen to me very carefully. You are a profoundly lucky girl. Kendrick is a pinnacle of success. Do you see the women in this room looking at him? He is a brilliant, wealthy, powerful man who pulled you out of a mediocre life and gave you the world. He buys you everything. He funds my lifestyle. He is an absolute gold mine." I looked up at her, letting the silence stretch for a fraction of a second. She had zero concern for her daughter's physical safety. She saw the fear in my eyes, she saw the tension in my body, and her only instinct was to protect her access to Kendrick's bank accounts. "You better fix whatever attitude problem you are carrying around right now," Linda continued, pointing a threatening finger at my chest. "You are nothing without him. If you push him away, if you complain, if you embarrass him with your clumsy, dramatic behavior, he will replace you by tomorrow morning. You smile, you nod, and you keep this man happy. You be a good, obedient wife, and you secure this life. Do not dare ruin this for our family because you cannot handle his temper." The absolute putrid toxicity of her words settled over me. Linda was not just a bystander to Brianna's abuse. She was an active, willing enabler. She was happily sacrificing her own flesh and blood on the altar of high society wealth. She would gladly watch her daughter be beaten, broken, and locked in a psychiatric ward as long as her country club dues were paid on time. I looked deep into my mother's eyes. I did not show her the fury boiling inside my chest. I did not show her the highly trained tactical operative who could dismantle her entire existence with a single phone call. I simply offered her the vacant, defeated expression she expected from her broken daughter. "You are right, Mom," I whispered, my voice completely dead and hollow. "I will make sure he gets exactly what he deserves tonight." Linda sighed, smoothing the front of my emerald gown with a dismissive pat. "Good. Now fix your face, go back out there, and act like you belong in this room." She turned and walked back toward the glittering chandeliers, entirely oblivious to the fact that she had just signed her own social and financial death warrant. I took one last slow breath in the shadows of the alcove. The trap was fully set. The guests had all arrived. It was time to pull the trigger. I stepped out of the dim alcove and walked back into the glittering expanse of the grand ballroom, leaving my mother and her sickening advice in the shadows. The opulent space was vibrating with the low, steady hum of extreme wealth and predatory ambition. I navigated through the sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns, keeping my posture deliberately submissive, my eyes downcast. I found Kendrick exactly where I knew he would be. He was holding court at Table 1, the undisputed center of gravity for the Chicago financial elite. He was seated between two prominent industry titans. I recognized their faces immediately from the corporate dossiers I had memorized years ago. To his left was Richard Montgomery, a ruthless venture capitalist known for gutting emerging tech startups. To his right sat Harrison Cole, the billionaire chairman of a multinational energy conglomerate. These were the massive whales Kendrick was actively bleeding dry to fund his offshore escape. They were the very men whose money was supposed to bounce to the Cayman Islands today. Kendrick noticed my approach. He extended his uninjured left arm, wrapping it securely around my waist and pulling me firmly into the empty chair beside him. His grip was entirely possessive, his fingers digging sharply into the delicate silk of my emerald gown. To the casual observer across the table, it was a display of fierce protective affection from a loving husband. To me, it was a physical restraint, a silent command to sit still and play my designated role. The conversation at the table was heavy, dominated by aggressive financial posturing. Kendrick was in his absolute element. As a prominent African-American hedge fund manager who had seemingly conquered the ruthless Chicago market, he commanded the room with an effortless, magnetic charisma. He spoke with deep authority about global market fluctuations, using his left hand to gesture expansively while keeping his splinted right hand resting on the white linen tablecloth. He was spinning a complex, masterful illusion of profitability, throwing out fabricated profit margins and entirely fictional projected returns. I sat silently by his side, functioning exactly as he intended. I was a prop. I was a beautiful, silent accessory purchased to elevate his status, no different from the expensive diamond necklace resting cold against my collarbone. I picked up my crystal water glass, taking a slow sip, maintaining the vacant, pleasant smile my sister had been forced to wear for 5 years. The dynamic at the table shifted slightly when Richard Montgomery leaned back in his chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Richard looked directly across the table at me, offering a polite, patronizing smile. "And what about you, Brianna?" Richard asked, his voice cutting through the heavy financial jargon. "Kendrick here has been monopolizing the conversation with yield curves and asset allocations all night. A beautiful woman like yourself must get terribly bored listening to us old men debate global market risks. What is your perspective on all of this chaos in the overseas markets?" It was a standard, harmless pleasantry. It was the kind of superficial question wealthy men asked trophy wives at charity galas just to be polite before returning to their real conversations. Before I could even part my lips to offer a demure, rehearsed response, Kendrick intercepted. His reaction was instantaneous and aggressively dismissive. He did not just answer for me. He used the opportunity to publicly obliterate my intelligence for the entertainment of his investors. Kendrick let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed across the crystal glassware. He patted my knee under the table, his fingers squeezing hard enough to leave a fresh bruise. "Oh, Richard, please do not bother my wife with concepts like global asset risks," Kendrick declared, his voice carrying loudly enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "My wife only knows how to swipe credit cards. She does not understand investment risks or market volatility. The only financial fluctuation Brianna cares about is whether the new seasonal collection at the designer boutiques downtown is on sale." The delivery was flawless. It was perfectly packaged as a charming, affectionate joke from a benevolent provider who spoiled his simple-minded wife. The reaction from the table was immediate and sickening. Richard Montgomery chuckled loudly, raising his glass in a toast to Kendrick. Harrison Cole let out a booming laugh, slapping the table in amusement. Even the other wives sitting nearby offered tight, uncomfortable giggles, entirely complicit in the blatant misogyny. The entire circle of billionaires erupted in laughter at my expense. I sat perfectly still, frozen in the center of their amusement. The heat of humiliation was supposed to rise in my cheeks. I was supposed to look down at my lap, embarrassed, diminished, and entirely dependent on the man who had just publicly stripped me of my dignity. Under the table, Kendrick's grip on my knee tightened painfully. It was a physical threat enforcing the psychological strike. He was actively reading my body language, waiting for the flinch, waiting for the silent tears of embarrassment to well up in my eyes. This was his favorite game. This was how he had systematically broken my twin sister down over the last 5 years. He isolated her socially, right in front of a crowd. He established himself as the intellectual superior and cemented her status as his expensive, brainless pet. He used the laughter of the most powerful men in the city as a weapon to completely annihilate her self-worth. If you fight back against a joke, you are hysterical. If you sit silently, you are accepting the humiliation. It is a brilliant, vicious trap designed by a master manipulator. He isolated his victim in a room full of hundreds of people. I looked around the table at the laughing billionaires. They were looking at me with pure, unadulterated pity and amusement. They saw a woman who possessed absolutely zero value beyond her physical appearance. They saw a dependent liability who survived solely on the generosity of the brilliant hedge fund manager sitting beside her. I dropped my gaze to the white tablecloth, forcing a soft, embarrassed blush to my cheeks. I let my shoulders slump forward, just a fraction of an inch, giving Kendrick the exact physical submission he demanded. I let the laughter wash over me, absorbing the toxic, suffocating atmosphere of the gala. Kendrick smiled triumphantly, turning his attention back to Richard Montgomery to continue his fraudulent financial pitch. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully reinforced the invisible chains around my neck. He had absolutely no idea that the silent, embarrassed woman sitting next to him was currently calculating the exact trajectory required to tear his entire empire down to the bedrock. The trap had been sprung, but Kendrick was the one standing on the trigger. The laughter around the table eventually subsided, replaced by the clinking of heavy silverware against fine china. Kendrick transitioned seamlessly from the crude joke about my intelligence straight into his primary financial pitch. He leaned aggressively across the white linen tablecloth, locking his intense gaze with Richard Montgomery and Harrison Cole. He was pitching a massive capital venture in South America, specifically an agricultural and logistics transport hub located deep in the heart of Brazil. He promised the billionaires a guaranteed 25% annualized return, citing recently deregulated transit routes and a highly compliant local government. I let him speak uninterrupted for exactly 3 minutes. I sat with perfect posture and listened as he wove a tapestry of absolute financial fiction. I knew that exact Brazilian logistics corridor intimately. My corporate risk firm had recently conducted a top-tier threat assessment for a rival logistics conglomerate looking to expand into that same territory. We advised them to abandon the acquisition immediately or risk total corporate exposure. I gently placed my crystal water glass down on the table. The soft clink cut sharply through his booming, arrogant monologue. I leaned forward, resting my elbows gracefully on the edge of the table. I tilted my head, widening my eyes to project the absolute picture of naive, harmless curiosity. "But honey," I said, my voice light and breathy, perfectly mimicking a woman who was entirely out of her depth. "Is that not the same transit corridor that has been completely paralyzed by the dockworkers' union since last October?" Kendrick froze mid-sentence. His jaw tightened instantly, a hard muscle ticking in his cheek. Under the table, his large hand shot out and his fingers dug sharply into my thigh. It was a brutal, silent command to shut my mouth and remember my place. Brianna, Kendrick said, forcing a tight, deeply patronizing smile for the billionaires. "We are discussing macroeconomic infrastructure. It is a bit more complicated than whatever you saw on a morning talk show." He looked at Richard Montgomery, waving his uninjured hand dismissively to brush me away. "My wife worries too much. The labor disputes are minor inconveniences. Our local fixers have assured me the governor will intervene and clear the ports before the quarter ends." I did not flinch from the pain radiating from his grip on my leg. I slowly turned my head to look directly into Kendrick's eyes. I let the breathy, submissive tone vanish entirely. I dropped my voice to the cold, authoritative register I used when briefing military defense contractors. "The governor of that specific province was indicted on federal corruption charges 72 hours ago," I stated, my voice slicing through the ambient noise of the ballroom like a scalpel. "The dockworkers' union is not just striking, they have actively blockaded the primary transit artery. More importantly, the local syndicate has established a secondary checkpoint system along the exact highway route your presentation relies on. Your projected profit margins do not account for the 40% extortion tariff required to simply move the freight from your proposed warehouse to the port." The table went deathly quiet. The low hum of conversation from the surrounding gala seemed to fade entirely into the background. Kendrick's hand went completely rigid on my leg. The blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his complexion an ashen, sickly gray. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert his dominance, to call me hysterical again, but the words died in his throat. He was paralyzed by the sudden, overwhelming exposure. I turned my gaze away from my terrified husband and looked directly at Harrison Cole. The billionaire energy chairman was staring at me, his wine glass hovering motionless halfway to his mouth. His eyes were narrowed, evaluating me no longer as a piece of quiet eye candy, but as a sudden, highly lethal threat swimming in his waters. Furthermore, I continued, holding Harrison's gaze with absolute, unyielding confidence. "The Brazilian real is facing a severe devaluation cycle due to the current political vacuum. If you inject the capital Kendrick is asking for today, the currency conversion alone will eat a 12% deficit before a single shipping container leaves the dock. You are not looking at a 25% return. You are looking at a guaranteed capital sinkhole that will require a federal bailout within 8 months." Richard Montgomery slowly set his scotch down on a heavy leather coaster. The amused, predatory smirk he had worn while laughing at Kendrick's misogynistic joke had been entirely wiped away. He leaned forward, lacing his fingers together suddenly, giving me his undivided, intense attention. "Kendrick," Richard said, his voice deadly quiet, his eyes never leaving my face. "You explicitly assured us the regional infrastructure was completely secured. You said the political risk was zero." "It is zero," Kendrick stammered, sweat beading heavily on his forehead. He desperately pulled his hand away from my leg, raising it defensively. "Richard, I promise you my analysts have run the numbers. She does not know what she is talking about. She is just repeating some nonsense she read online. She just quoted the exact risk assessment data that my private intelligence firm paid $500,000 to acquire yesterday morning." Harrison Cole interrupted, his voice booming with absolute authority. He finally turned his head to look at Kendrick with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Your wife just saved me from making a monumental, unforced error. You were going to let me walk blind into a cartel extortion racket and a collapsed supply chain." Kendrick was visibly trembling now. The master manipulator, the untouchable titan of Chicago finance, was completely unraveling in real time. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He looked around the table, realizing that the power dynamic had violently and permanently shifted. He had brought a trophy wife to the table to elevate his status, and she had just publicly executed his fraudulent business venture in under 2 minutes. Harrison Cole ignored Kendrick entirely. He reached inside his tailored tuxedo jacket and pulled out a heavy matte black card case. He extracted a thick card with gold embossed lettering and slid it across the white tablecloth directly to me. "Brianna, is it?" Harrison asked, his tone shifting from dismissive arrogance to high professional respect. "Yes," I replied smoothly, tapping the edge of the gold card with my index finger. "I need someone with your exact level of geopolitical risk assessment sitting on my advisory board," Harrison stated loudly, making absolutely sure Kendrick heard every single syllable. "My current analysts missed that federal indictment entirely. You have a sharper eye for hazard logistics than men I pay 7 figures a year. Do you have a card? I would like my executive team to contact you tomorrow morning to discuss a consulting fee." I offered a perfectly calibrated, dangerous smile. I leaned back in my chair, projecting absolute dominance over the space. "I am currently transitioning between ventures, Harrison, but I will ensure you have my direct contact information before the night ends. I am always open to discussing lucrative risk management strategies." Richard Montgomery chuckled, a genuine appreciative sound that drove another nail into Kendrick's coffin. Richard reached for his own card case. "Put me on that list as well, Brianna. It is incredibly refreshing to meet someone in this city who actually does their homework, instead of just selling smoke and mirrors to get a check." The two billionaires completely turned their backs on Kendrick. They began discussing the global supply chain, actively directing their complex questions to me, valuing my input, and hanging on my every word. I answered them with clinical precision. I wielded my military intelligence background like a heavy sword, effortlessly cementing my status as the smartest person in the room. I glanced to my right. Kendrick was sitting frozen in his chair. He was sweating profusely, his expensive designer cologne, now mixed with the sour, acrid stench of absolute panic. He stared blankly at his splinted right hand resting on the table, his broad chest heaving. He had been thoroughly and publicly emasculated. He had lost his wealthiest investors. He had lost his total control over the narrative. And most terrifyingly for him, he had just realized that the woman sitting next to him was infinitely smarter, infinitely more dangerous, and vastly more powerful than he could ever comprehend. I needed to leave the table before Kendrick completely spontaneously combusted. His heavy breathing and the absolute panic radiating from his rigid posture signaled an impending breakdown. I offered a polite professional smile to Harrison Cole and Richard Montgomery, gently declining their immediate offers for a follow-up drink. I excused myself to the powder room, my emerald silk gown trailing elegantly across the plush carpet of the grand ballroom. The moment I stepped away from the table, I felt the sharp, predatory gaze of my mother burning into my back. I knew Linda would not let my public display of intelligence go unpunished. She had spent her entire life ensuring my sister remained small, quiet, and dependent. Seeing Brianna suddenly wield absolute financial dominance over a table of billionaires must have felt like a direct threat to her own parasitic lifestyle. I pushed open the heavy oak door of the luxury women's lounge. The room was lined with gold-framed mirrors and smelled of expensive lilies. It was currently empty. 10 seconds later, the heavy door slammed shut behind me with a violent thud. Linda stormed into the room, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. The polite high society facade she wore in the ballroom had completely vanished. She marched across the marble floor, her diamond earrings shaking aggressively. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she hissed, her voice echoing sharply against the bathroom tiles. "What exactly do you think you are doing out there? You just humiliated your husband in front of the most powerful men in Chicago. Do you have a death wish?" I turned slowly to face her, letting the cold water run over my hands at the marble sink. I kept my posture slightly hunched, giving her one last chance to show even a fraction of maternal concern. I was trying to save his investors from a massive fraud. I replied softly, testing her boundaries. He was lying to them, Mom. He is going to lose everything. Linda let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed off the mirrors. I do not care if he is lying to the Pope. He pays the bills. He pays my mortgage. He bought that emerald dress on your back. You are supposed to sit there, look pretty, and keep his wallet open. Do you understand what happens if he cuts us off? Do you understand that you have absolutely zero value without his name? You just destroyed a multi-million-dollar deal because you wanted to play smart. He is going to be furious when he gets you home, and I will not blame him one bit for whatever he does to teach you a lesson. The absolute venom in her words crystallized my resolve. She knew Kendrick was abusive. She fully expected him to physically punish my sister tonight, and she actively welcomed it as long as the bank transfers kept clearing. I turned off the brass faucet and reached for a linen towel. I did not say a word. My silence only infuriated her further. Do not you dare ignore me, Linda shrieked, stepping directly into my personal space. She raised her hand high, aiming a vicious open-palmed slap directly at my face. She intended to leave a red mark right across my cheekbone, a physical reminder of my subservience before I returned to my master. The strike never landed. My left hand shot upward with blinding mechanical precision. I caught her wrist in mid-air, my fingers locking around her delicate bones like an industrial vice grip. The sudden violent halt of her momentum sent a shockwave up her arm. Linda gasped, her eyes widening in sudden confusion. She tried to yank her arm away, but my grip was absolute immovable stone. The terrified, submissive daughter she thought she was bullying vanished into thin air. I straightened my spine, rising to my full height. The manufactured hunch in my shoulders evaporated. The trembling, fragile posture I had maintained all evening was instantly replaced by the rigid, lethal stance of a seasoned military commander. I stepped forward, forcing Linda to stumble backward until her spine hit the cold marble wall. I leaned in close, my face mere inches from hers. I dropped the soft, breathy pitch of my sister's voice completely. When I spoke, my natural, commanding baritone cut through the air like shattered glass. Did you forget which child actually knows how to break a wrist, Mother? I asked, my voice devoid of any human warmth. Linda stopped breathing. All the color instantly drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her jaw went slack, and a cold, terrified sweat broke out across her forehead. She stared deep into my eyes. She was no longer looking at the soft, broken gaze of her favored daughter. She was looking directly into the ruthless, calculating, dead eyes of the child she had spent a lifetime rejecting. The military police officer, the security chief, the daughter who did not cry. Blair, Linda whispered, her voice choking on pure, unadulterated horror. Her entire body began to tremble violently against the marble wall. What are you doing here? Where is your sister? I tightened my grip on her wrist just a fraction of an inch, ensuring she felt the exact pressure point that could snap her bone with a simple twist. My sister is currently locked inside a highly secured private trauma clinic. I stated, my words precise and lethal. She is resting with 3 shattered ribs and a split cheekbone, because the man you just defended nearly beat her to death last night, and instead of protecting your own flesh and blood, you just stood in this bathroom and told me I deserved it for risking his bank account. Linda let out a choked, terrified whimper. She tried to squirm away, but she was completely pinned. You are insane, she stammered, her eyes darting frantically toward the locked door. Kendrick will kill you when he finds out. He will call the police. He will lock you away. Kendrick is currently sitting at a table sweating through his custom suit because I just systematically dismantled his entire fraudulent empire in front of his biggest investors. I whispered, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. He thinks I am his broken wife. He thinks he locked a victim inside his house tonight. He has absolutely no idea that I have already bypassed his security grid, hacked his offshore accounts, and handed his entire financial history to federal investigators. And you, Mother, are going to walk right back out into that ballroom, and you are going to sit down, and you are going to keep your mouth completely shut. Linda shook her head frantically, fresh tears of panic ruining her expensive makeup. You cannot do this. He funds everything. I will lose my house. I will lose my country club memberships. I will be ruined. I leaned closer, my voice dropping to a deadly, icy whisper. You told me earlier that Kendrick was the perfect provider. You told me I was a massive disappointment. Well, Mother, the perfect provider you worship is a highly documented felon who is going to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Your house was collateral for a Ponzi scheme that is currently collapsing in real time. You are already ruined. You just do not have the intelligence to realize it yet. I released her wrist with a sudden violent shove. Linda slumped against the vanity, gasping for air and clutching her arm. She looked at me as if I were a ghost, a terrifying, unstoppable force that had just bulldozed her entire reality. If you breathe a single word of this to Kendrick, if you even look at him the wrong way before this night is over, I will personally ensure the federal prosecutors know exactly how much of his stolen money you knowingly accepted over the last 5 years. I promise, stepping back and smoothing the front of my emerald gown. You will share a prison cell block with him. Do we understand each other? Linda nodded frantically, unable to speak, her chest heaving with silent, terrified sobs. Excellent, I said, turning my back on her and facing the gold-framed mirror. I calmly reapplied a layer of lipstick, my hands perfectly steady. I checked my posture, instantly sliding the mask of the submissive, quiet wife back into place. I walked toward the heavy oak door without a second glance at the trembling woman crying on the floor. I pulled the door open and stepped back into the glittering light of the grand ballroom. The final phase of the operation was about to begin. The ride back to the sprawling suburban estate was completely devoid of conversation. Kendrick sat in the furthest corner of the Maybach, his right hand still splinted, his left hand gripping a crystal tumbler of scotch he had brought from the hotel suite. The silence was not the heavy, oppressive quiet of a man who had won. It was the frantic, suffocating stillness of a predator realizing he was bleeding out. He stared out the tinted windows at the passing Chicago skyline, his jaw clenched so tightly I could hear his teeth grinding. I maintained my position on the opposite side of the leather bench, my hands neatly folded in my lap, projecting the image of a terrified wife anticipating her punishment. The heavy iron gates of his compound swung open, swallowing the vehicle into the dark, rain-slicked driveway. The storm had passed, leaving behind a freezing, biting chill. The moment the chauffeur opened the door, Kendrick marched up the front steps without looking back. He bypassed the grand staircase and headed directly for his private study. I followed him, my bare feet sinking into the thick plush carpets, my emerald gown swishing softly against the floorboards. I needed to keep him in my line of sight. The extraction protocol was still counting down, and I had to maintain complete operational control of his environment. Step inside and close the door, Kendrick ordered, his voice dangerously low. I stepped into the dim, mahogany-paneled office and pushed the heavy, frosted glass door shut. The biometric lock engaged with a solid click. Kendrick stood behind his massive desk, the very desk where I had breached his firewall hours earlier. He poured himself another glass of bourbon, the liquid splashing erratically over the rim. He was unraveling. The flawless African-American financial titan who commanded the ballroom was gone, replaced by a paranoid cornered animal. "Who gave you that intelligence report?" he demanded, slamming the crystal decanter down. "Do not lie to me. Harrison Cole is a shark, but he does not share classified geopolitical logistics with a housewife. Did Richard Montgomery approach you at the country club? Did one of his corporate spies hand you a script to read? You are going to tell me exactly who paid you to sabotage my pitch tonight, or I will make sure you never see Leo again." I kept my eyes locked on the floor, adopting a slight trembling hunch in my shoulders. "Nobody paid me," I whispered, keeping my vocal register high and breathy. "I just read an article online. I thought I was helping." "Do not play stupid with me," Kendrick roared, sweeping a stack of leather-bound files off his desk. "You do not know the difference between a supply chain deficit and a grocery receipt. Someone fed you that specific extortion tariff data. Someone breached my inner circle." He turned away from me, his breathing jagged and erratic. He walked over to a concealed wall safe hidden behind a framed modern art piece. He punched in a digital code with his uninjured left hand. The heavy steel door swung open. I expected him to pull out cash or documents. Instead, he retrieved a highly specialized piece of hardware. It was a handheld radio frequency scanner, a military-grade bug sweeper used exclusively to detect covert listening devices and unauthorized data transmissions. My heart rate remained at a steady, calm rhythm, but my tactical assessment shifted instantly into the red zone. I had planted a microtransmitter under the lip of his desk to monitor his phone calls while I was confined to the upper floors. The device was heavily shielded, but a scanner of that caliber would catch the localized signal bleed. "You think I am an idiot?" Kendrick hissed, powering on the scanner. The small device emitted a low, rhythmic hum. "You think I do not know how these corporate bastards operate? They bugged my office. They used my own wife as a Trojan horse to gather intel. I am going to find whatever wire they planted in here, and then I am going to destroy you." He began sweeping the room, waving the black wand over the leather sofas, the bookshelves, and the heavy velvet curtains. The device remained silent. He moved closer to the false wall panel, hiding his server rack. Still nothing. Then he stepped behind his massive mahogany desk. The scanner instantly shrieked. A sharp, high-pitched electronic squeal pierced the air. A cluster of red lights illuminated on the digital display, indicating a strong, active transmission signal. Kendrick froze. He dropped to his knees, running his left hand frantically along the underside of the thick wooden desk. A second later, he ripped the microtransmitter from its adhesive backing. He stood up, holding the tiny matte black device between his thumb and forefinger. It was smaller than a coin, but its presence was an absolute death sentence to his entire narrative. He stared at the bug, his chest heaving. Then he slowly raised his head and looked directly at me. The transition in his eyes was immediate and terrifying. The paranoid anger vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating realization. He looked at the highly sophisticated military-grade transmitter in his hand. Then he looked at my posture. He looked at the way I was standing, perfectly balanced, my weight distributed evenly across both feet. He looked at the fact that I was not hyperventilating, crying, or begging for my life. He remembered the blinding, precise speed of the joint lock that had snapped his finger in the foyer. "You did not get this from a corporate spy." Kendrick stated, his voice completely hollowed out by a sudden, chilling clarity. "Richard Montgomery does not use Department of Defense surveillance tech." He dropped the transmitter onto the floor and crushed it under the heel of his expensive leather shoe. The electronic squeal died instantly. The room plunged back into a suffocating silence. Kendrick turned his back to me and reached into the open wall safe one more time. When he turned around, he was holding a matte black Glock 19. He racked the slide with his left hand, chambering around with a sharp metallic clack. He raised the weapon, pointing the barrel directly at the center of my chest. His hand was not shaking. The facade of the civilized hedge fund manager was completely gone. He was a ruthless, cornered predator ready to kill to protect his empire. "You did not watch a self-defense video on the internet," Kendrick said, his eyes narrowing into deadly, venomous slits. "Brianna cannot even stand the sight of a weapon. Brianna cries when I raise my voice. Brianna does not have the stomach to look two billionaires in the eye and dismantle a global logistics forecast without blinking." He stepped out from behind the desk, closing the distance between us, the muzzle of the Glock unwavering. "You are not my wife," he snarled, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "You are the military police sister. You are the soldier." I did not gasp. I did not flinch. I slowly raised my head, dropping the hunched, submissive posture entirely. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back into a perfect, rigid military stance. I let the cold, dead, unforgiving light of a combat veteran flood into my eyes. The helpless trophy wife evaporated into the freezing air of the study. I looked down the barrel of his loaded weapon, a slow, predatory smile curving the corners of my lips. "It took you long enough to figure it out," I replied, my natural commanding baritone echoing sharply against the mahogany walls. Kendrick tightened his grip on the gun, his jaw ticking violently. "Where is she? Where is my wife?" "She is somewhere you will never ever find her," I stated, stepping forward. I did not move away from the gun. I stepped deliberately toward it, cutting his reaction time in half. And you made a catastrophic tactical error tonight, Kendrick. You pulled a gun on an unarmed woman because you think a piece of metal makes you powerful. But you forgot one crucial detail about military police. We never walk into a hostile environment without a contingency plan. You are standing in a burning building, and you do not even smell the smoke yet. Kendrick tightened his grip on the Glock, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. I watched the tendons in his hand strain against the metal frame. The room was so quiet, I could hear the expensive ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He desperately wanted to pull it. He wanted to erase the public humiliation I had inflicted on him at the gala. But his eyes darted frantically, performing a high-speed, desperate risk calculation. If he pulled that trigger, the gunshot would echo across his pristine suburban estate. The smart home sensors might even detect the acoustic anomaly and trigger an automated police dispatch. A dead woman in his study meant a homicide investigation. Detectives would seize his servers. Forensic accountants would rip through his ledgers. His $200 million offshore escape would instantly evaporate. The Ponzi scheme would be plastered across every major news network before sunrise. He knew it. I knew it. The barrel of the Glock lowered just a fraction of an inch. A harsh, uneven breath shuddered out of his chest. He was a coward who preferred financial ruin over physical confrontation, and shooting a highly trained operative face to face was a line he simply did not have the stomach to cross. "You are not going to die tonight," Kendrick said, his voice regaining that sickening, arrogant cadence. He kept the weapon raised just enough to maintain the threat. "You are going to be far more useful to me alive. Hand over your communication devices. Now." I did not hesitate. I reached into the hidden pocket of the emerald gown and withdrew a sleek encrypted smartphone. It was a standard corporate model, completely sanitized, functioning solely as a decoy. I tossed it onto the center of his mahogany desk. Kendrick snatched it up with his left hand. He did not bother trying to bypass the lock screen. He raised his heavy leather shoe and brought his heel down with vicious force, shattering the glass screen into a spiderweb of useless fragments. He ground his heel into the casing until the internal battery snapped and hissed. He kicked the debris aside, a triumphant smirk returning to his handsome, sweat-slicked face. "There goes your rescue protocol," he mocked. "You think you can waltz into my house and play spy games. You think because you wore a uniform once you are untouchable. You are dealing with a man who buys and sells private armies for breakfast." He reached for the secure landline on his desk, keeping his eyes locked on me. He pressed a single speed dial button. The call connected instantly. "I need the cleanup crew at the main estate immediately," Kendrick ordered into the receiver. "Full lockdown. Lethal force authorized for any external breach. Get inside now." He hung up the phone and leaned back against the edge of his desk, crossing his arms. The Glock rested easily in his grip, pointing casually at my knees. He was regaining his twisted equilibrium. "Did you really think I relied solely on local cops and automated cameras?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "I manage billions of dollars. I have enemies far more dangerous than a disgruntled sister-in-law. My private security detail consists of men who were clearing out hostile sectors while you were still learning how to salute." Less than 4 minutes later, the heavy, frosted glass door of the study swung open. 3 massive figures stepped into the room, instantly dominating the physical space. They did not look like standard corporate bodyguards. They wore dark, unmarked tactical gear, heavy ballistic vests, and carried suppressed submachine guns strapped tightly to their chests. Their movements were coordinated, aggressive, and highly trained. Ex-military contractors, mercenaries who sold their lethal skills to the highest bidder. The lead contractor, a towering man with a thick scar cutting across his jawline, scanned the room before locking his dead professional eyes on me. "Perimeter is secured, Mr. Chairman," the lead mercenary reported, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Jamming devices are active. No cellular or radio signals are leaving this property. What are your orders regarding the intruder?" Kendrick let out a dark, booming laugh. The presence of his hired muscle had fully restored his bloated ego. He walked around the desk, standing safely behind the wall of armed men. "She is not an intruder," Kendrick announced smoothly, slipping his gun back into his shoulder holster. "She is my insurance policy." He looked directly at me, his eyes gleaming with absolute malice. "You thought you were so clever pulling this little switch. You thought you could distract me while your sister ran away. But you just handed me the ultimate leverage. Brianna is weak. She is sentimental. She might run from me, but she will never abandon her own flesh and blood." I maintained my rigid, emotionless stance, letting him outline his entire strategy. "I am going to keep you locked inside this house," Kendrick continued, pacing slowly behind his guards. "I am going to hold you hostage in the very cage you thought you were infiltrating. And then I am going to send a message to whatever miserable hole Brianna is hiding in. I will tell her exactly what these gentlemen are going to do to her beloved twin sister if she does not return immediately." He stopped pacing and pointed his splinted, wrapped finger at my face. "She is going to bring my son back to this house. She is going to sit down at this very desk, and she is going to sign every single legal document, transferring the clean assets, the trust funds, and the property deeds entirely into my name. She is going to sign away her parental rights. She is going to give me everything I need to walk away from this city as a completely free and incredibly wealthy man. And she will do it because she knows I will let my dogs tear you apart if she refuses." I looked at the three heavily armed mercenaries surrounding me. I evaluated their stances, their weapon retention, and their spatial awareness. They were intimidating, absolutely. They relied on overwhelming force and the intimidation factor of their tactical gear. But their positioning in the enclosed study was flawed. The lead man was standing too close to the heavy glass door, obstructing his own line of fire. The other two had allowed their focus to drift toward Kendrick, while he gave his arrogant speech, breaking their visual containment on me. They were arrogant because they were facing a woman in an emerald silk evening gown. "You are extremely confident for a man whose financial empire is currently built on toothpicks," I stated, my voice echoing coldly in the tense room. "You really think 3 hired guns can hold a military police veteran hostage?" Kendrick sneered, stepping closer to the lead mercenary. "I think 3 heavily armed combat veterans can handle 1 arrogant woman playing dress-up. You have no weapons. You have no backup. You have absolutely no way out of this room. You are going to sit on that floor and pray your sister drives fast." He looked at his hired men. "Strip her of any concealed items. Bind her wrists with zip ties. If she fights back, break her legs." Kendrick turned his back, supremely confident that his money had bought him absolute control over my fate. He walked toward his desk to retrieve his tablet, entirely unaware that he had just issued an order to engage an apex predator who had been waiting patiently for the exact moment to strike. I did not flinch. I did not beg. I simply shifted my weight to the balls of my feet, letting the heavy silk of the gown pool around my ankles, ready to execute a flawless, brutal sequence of close-quarters combat. The lead mercenary took a heavy step forward, unspooling a thick plastic zip tie from his tactical vest. He moved with the casual, bored confidence of a man who assumed subduing a woman in an evening gown would take less than 5 seconds. Kendrick remained facing his mahogany desk, his back turned to the room, completely absorbed in the illusion of his own absolute power. He honestly believed his commercial-grade signal jammers had isolated his mansion from the rest of the world. He believed crushing my decoy smartphone had severed my only lifeline. He was a financial criminal playing a very dangerous game with military protocols he could not possibly comprehend. Standard signal jammers block cellular towers, Wi-Fi routers, and basic radio frequencies. They create a localized dead zone that effectively blinds civilian technology. But I do not operate with civilian technology. When I swapped Brianna's designer heels for my tactical combat boots in that dark alleyway hours ago, I was not just preparing for physical combat. I was equipping a mobile command center. Built directly into the reinforced rubber sole of my right boot was an ultra-low frequency burst transmitter. It operated on a subterranean wavelength, completely invisible to Kendrick's expensive over-the-counter security sweepers. I kept my hands visible, resting them lightly against the silk fabric of the emerald dress. I let my breathing remain perfectly slow and rhythmic. I needed the mercenaries to believe I was paralyzed by fear, frozen in place like a cornered animal waiting to be bound. Underneath the hem of the gown, my right foot shifted a fraction of an inch against the polished hardwood floor. Inside the reinforced toe box of my boot, my big toe located the microscopic pressure sensor embedded in the lining. The device required a highly specific synchronized sequence of physical pressure to activate. A random step or a stumble would register as background noise. It required intentional, precise rhythmic force. I began to tap. I applied pressure to the sensor, executing a rapid, flawless sequence of Morse code. Dash dot dash dot. Two short taps followed by a long, heavy press. It was a customized, encrypted handshake. I was not sending an audio distress call or a GPS location ping. I was sending a silent, microscopic data packet containing a single randomized alphanumeric trigger code. The signal punched straight through the heavy walls of the mansion, diving beneath the range of the jammers, and bouncing off a secure satellite relay, orbiting miles above the freezing Chicago skyline. Miles away inside the secure, soundproof back room of the private trauma clinic, Declan was sitting in the dark, watching a command terminal with relentless focus. The moment my ultra-low frequency ping hit his encrypted server, the screen flashed a brilliant solid green. The authorization handshake was complete. I did not need to upload the massive damning files from Kendrick's server over a weak signal. I had already bypassed his firewall and copied his entire digital ledger onto Declan's remote server hours ago when I first breached the study. But that data was locked behind a dead man's switch. It required my final biometric authorization from the field to execute the payload. My foot tapping the pressure sensor was the key turning in the nuclear launch sequence. With that single string of Morse code, I authorized Declan to unleash absolute hell. I knew exactly what was happening on Declan's end of the secure connection. The automated script we had built sprang into action instantly. It packaged the entirety of Kendrick's fraudulent financial existence into heavily encrypted, undeniable digital dossiers. The files contained the raw, unedited ledgers of his massive Ponzi scheme. They held the detailed routing numbers showing how he actively laundered extortion money for overseas cartels. They included the exact timestamps, IP addresses, and offshore account numbers for the $200 million wire transfer he was attempting to steal today. Declan did not send this data to the corrupt local police precinct. He bypassed the entire state of Illinois. The automated script delivered the unredacted files directly into the secure intake servers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Financial Crimes Division in Washington. A duplicate copy was simultaneously blasted to the enforcement directors of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission. I kept my eyes locked on the lead mercenary approaching me. He was 3 feet away now, the thick plastic zip tie looping around his thick calloused fingers. He had absolutely no idea that the ground beneath this entire estate had just crumbled into dust. Kendrick was still leaning over his desk, tapping confidently on his master control tablet, finalizing the details of his private charter flight to the Caribbean. He was smiling. He was breathing easily. He thought he was a ghost slipping away into the tropical sunset, with a fortune in stolen capital and a beautiful mistress waiting on the tarmac. He was not a ghost. He was the most highly documented federal fugitive in the country. The countdown clock had officially started. The moment those files hit the federal server's automated alarms would trigger across multiple government agencies. Federal prosecutors would wake up judges to sign emergency no-knock warrants. Tactical teams would begin gearing up in armored vehicles, preparing to swarm this suburban fortress. The frozen, untraceable offshore accounts Kendrick thought he controlled were already being locked down by Federal Cyber Command. I just needed to buy time. I needed to hold this ground, occupy his attention, and keep him trapped inside this study until the federal hammer smashed his front door off its hinges. The lead mercenary reached out his massive, heavy hand, moving to grab my left wrist. "Put your hands behind your back," he commanded, his voice, a low, bored rumble. "Do not make me break your arm." Kendrick finally turned around, leaning his hip against the edge of his mahogany desk. He watched the mercenary close in on me, his eyes gleaming with malicious, arrogant satisfaction. "Tie her to the heavy chair in the corner," Kendrick instructed lazily, taking a slow sip from his crystal glass of bourbon. "Make the zip ties tight. I want her to feel exactly how helpless she really is, while we wait for her sister to bring my son back." I looked at Kendrick standing there in his expensive suit, radiating an aura of total, untouchable superiority. I looked at the three heavily armed men who thought they were earning an easy paycheck by intimidating a frightened housewife. The silent transmission from my boot was complete. The federal strike was already in motion. The trap was fully sealed and Kendrick was the one locked inside it. I did not put my hands behind my back. I let the subtle, terrified tremble in my shoulders vanish completely. I shifted my weight, establishing a perfect, highly balanced combat stance. I looked the massive lead mercenary dead in the eyes, abandoning the fragile disguise entirely. "You are going to need a lot more than zip ties," I stated, my voice ringing out with cold, absolute authority. The mercenary frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion crossing his hardened face just a fraction of a second before I moved. The time for digital warfare and silent surveillance was over. The physical extraction phase had begun. I tightened my fists, feeling the familiar lethal surge of combat adrenaline flood my veins. Kendrick wanted to see how helpless I was. I was about to show him a masterclass in kinetic violence. Kendrick's master control tablet chimed. It was not the soft, pleasant notification of a completed wire transfer. It was a harsh, repetitive, blaring alarm that cut through the heavy tension in the room like a police siren. He snatched the device from his mahogany desk, his eyes darting frantically across the high-resolution screen. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. His mouth opened but no sound came out. The $200 million offshore transfer had not just failed. The screen displayed a massive flashing red federal error code indicating a total and absolute asset freeze. His entire financial existence had been locked down by the United States government. The Cayman's account was unreachable. The domestic funds were seized. He looked up at me. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces. In his place stood a terrified, desperate animal who had just watched his entire criminal empire vaporize into thin air. "What did you do?" he whispered, his voice trembling with sheer, unadulterated panic. He tapped the screen aggressively with his uninjured hand, but the federal lock remained absolute. "What did you do to my accounts?" "I took out the trash," I replied coldly, keeping my posture perfectly rigid. Kendrick hurled the expensive tablet against the wall, shattering the screen into a shower of useless glass and sparked wiring. He turned to the three heavily armed mercenaries, the last remaining vestige of his purchased power. The sophisticated businessman was completely gone, exposing the violent, unhinged monster underneath. "Break both her legs!" Kendrick screamed, spit flying from his lips as he pointed his wrapped, mangled finger at me. "Do it right now. Break her legs and make her fix this." The lead mercenary, the massive man holding the thick plastic zip ties, lunged forward. He made the fatal amateur mistake of underestimating his target based on her clothing. He reached out with his massive hands, intending to grab my bare shoulders and force me violently to the floor. I did not retreat. I stepped directly inside his guard, closing the distance before his brain could process the movement. My right hand shot up the heel of my palm, striking the soft tissue of his throat with devastating, calculated force. He gagged loudly, his airway momentarily crushed by the kinetic impact. Before he could recover his balance, I grabbed the heavy canvas lapel of his tactical vest with my left hand, pulling his heavy frame forward to use his own momentum against him. I drove my knee upward in a brutal rising arc, burying it deep into his solar plexus. The breath left his lungs in a violent rush. As he doubled over, I reached out and snatched a solid tungsten steel tactical pen resting next to the crystal decanter on Kendrick's desk. I gripped it like an ice pick. The mercenary swung a blind, desperate backhand at my head, trying to clear his vision. I ducked effortlessly under the clumsy strike, pivoting smoothly to his blind side. I drove the blunt, reinforced steel tip of the pen directly into the brachial plexus nerve cluster beneath his armpit. His entire right arm went completely dead, dropping uselessly to his side as the nerve bundle short-circuited. I swept my heavy combat boot behind his knee and kicked out his remaining support. He crashed hard onto the polished hardwood floor. I stepped forward and stomped my heel down relentlessly on his exposed elbow joint. The sickening crack echoed sharply through the study. He screamed, rolling onto his side, completely neutralized and clutching his shattered arm. The second mercenary realized the situation had instantly escalated from a simple restraint job to a lethal physical threat. He dropped his hand to the suppressed submachine gun strapped to his chest, his finger moving rapidly toward the trigger guard. I did not give him the fraction of a second he needed to raise the barrel. I grabbed the heavy crystal bourbon decanter from the edge of the desk and hurled it directly at his face with maximum velocity. The heavy glass smashed against his cheekbone, sending a spray of amber liquid and sharp shards into his eyes. He roared in pain, raising his hands instinctively to protect his face. That was all the opening I needed. I closed the distance in 2 rapid strides, my emerald gown swirling around my legs. I grabbed the barrel of his weapon, twisting it sharply upward and away from my center of mass. With my free hand, I delivered a brutal palm strike to his chin, snapping his head backward and exposing his neck. I did not stop moving. I grabbed his heavy tactical belt and launched my entire body weight backward, executing a flawless judo sacrifice throw. We both went airborne. I used his massive frame to cushion my landing, driving him spine first into the thick glass top of the low coffee table in the center of the room. The table exploded into a shower of jagged, lethal splinters. The mercenary groaned, the breath knocked completely out of him by the devastating impact. He reached blindly for the pistol holstered at his hip. I grabbed a long, sharp shard of thick glass from the ruined table. I did not hesitate. I drove the makeshift blade straight down through the thick canvas fabric of his shoulder strap, pinning his uniform securely to the heavy wooden frame of the ruined table beneath him. The glass sliced deep into his deltoid muscle. He screamed, his arm flailing uselessly against the wood. He was pinned, bleeding heavily and entirely out of the fight. The third mercenary was the smartest of the group. He saw his 2 partners dismantled in less than 15 seconds. He stepped back toward the heavy, frosted glass door, widening his stance, and drew a heavy, serrated combat knife from his belt. He was not going to try to grab me. He was going to try to cut me to pieces. "You are dead," he hissed, circling me slowly, keeping the blade angled upward in a professional fighter grip. I stood up slowly from the ruined coffee table, shaking the fine glass dust from my emerald silk gown. My breathing was perfectly even. The combat adrenaline was burning hot through my veins, sharpening my vision, slowing down time to a manageable crawl. I evaluated his stance clinically. His footwork was decent, but his weight was biased heavily on his right leg. He favored his dominant hand and left his lead knee terribly exposed. He lunged, thrusting the knife toward my midsection in a rapid, lethal arc designed to gut me. I sidestepped the blade with a millimeter to spare. I did not block the knife arm. I attacked his structural support. I delivered a devastating, low, sweeping kick directly to the side of his planted right knee. The joint hyperextended inward with a loud, wet pop. His leg buckled instantly, his balance completely destroyed by the sudden loss of skeletal integrity. As he fell forward, grasping for the desk to stop his momentum, I grabbed his knife hand by the wrist. I twisted his arm into a brutal, inescapable kimura lock, applying maximum torque to his shoulder joint. He cried out in agony, the heavy combat knife slipping from his paralyzed fingers to clatter loudly against the hardwood. I stepped over his back, pressing my knee firmly against his spine, and pulled his trapped arm straight upward until I felt the rotator cuff completely tear. He collapsed flat onto the floor, gasping for air, thoroughly incapacitated. I stood up in the center of the ruined study. 3 massive, heavily armed mercenaries lay groaning and bleeding on the floor around me. The entire brutal engagement had taken exactly 22 seconds. I calmly smoothed the front of my silk dress and turned my gaze back to Kendrick. He was backed into the furthest corner of the room, his face an absolute mask of unadulterated terror. He looked at the bodies on the floor, and then he looked at me finally, realizing he was trapped inside a cage with a monster he could never control. The absolute silence in the ruined study lasted for exactly 10 seconds. I stood breathing evenly amidst the groaning bodies of the incapacitated mercenaries. The heavy scent of spilled bourbon, sweat, and copper filled the enclosed space. Kendrick remained pressed flat against the farthest wall of his office. His chest heaved erratically. He was looking at me not as a disobedient wife, but as a supernatural threat he could not comprehend. I took a single deliberate step toward him. Before my combat boot could fully connect with the hardwood floor, a blinding wash of erratic red and blue light slashed violently across the frosted glass windows of the study. The piercing, unmistakable shriek of multiple police sirens shattered the quiet isolation of the suburban estate. The noise did not approach gradually. It materialized instantly at the front gates, indicating that a fleet of patrol cruisers had been running dark and silent through the neighborhood before activating their light bars directly outside the property line. Kendrick had not just summoned a private cleanup crew when he made that phone call from his desk. He had simultaneously triggered a specialized priority panic alarm wired directly to the local precinct. He had called in the very police force he effectively owned. The paralyzing terror on Kendrick's face vanished in a fraction of a second. The arrival of the local authorities acted like a massive injection of synthetic courage straight into his veins. He pushed himself off the wall, his posture instantly transforming from a cowering coward to a deeply traumatized innocent victim. He fell to his knees near the edge of his mahogany desk, cradling his splinted right hand against his chest, and forced his breathing into rapid, ragged, hysterical gasps. Heavy, frantic footsteps thundered across the marble foyer outside. Multiple voices shouted overlapping tactical commands. The biometric lock on the study door did not matter anymore. A heavy battering ram smashed into the frosted glass. The expensive panel exploded inward, raining sharp fragments across the expensive rugs. 5 uniformed police officers poured into the room, sweeping the space with blinding tactical flashlights attached to the barrels of their drawn service weapons. The beams of harsh white light cut through the dim room, instantly snapping onto my chest, my face, and my empty hands. "Drop to the floor right now!" The lead officer roared, his voice cracking with manufactured adrenaline. "Get on the ground and put your hands behind your head, or I will fire." My tactical assessment of the situation took less than a heartbeat. I could disarm the lead officer and use his body armor as a kinetic shield against the other 4. I could plunge the room into total darkness by shattering the primary light switch panel with a thrown object. But engaging uniformed municipal police officers with lethal force was a catastrophic tactical error. It would instantly invalidate the massive federal trap I had just triggered. It would transform me from a covert intelligence operative into a domestic terrorist in the eyes of the law. I had summoned the federal government to dismantle Kendrick's empire. I just needed to survive the next 5 minutes until the real authorities arrived. I did not raise my hands in a defensive posture. I did not speak a single word of protest. I smoothly lowered myself to my knees, lacing my fingers securely behind my head, and stared dead ahead into the blinding flashlights. The officers did not approach with standard protocol. They swarmed me with excessive, brutal, performative force. 2 heavy bodies crashed into my shoulders, driving me violently face first into the hardwood floor. The impact forced the breath from my lungs. A heavy knee dropped squarely between my shoulder blades, pressing my spine painfully against the floorboards. Rough, calloused hands grabbed my wrists, yanking my arms backward with enough torque to strain my rotator cuffs. The cold, rigid steel of heavy-duty police handcuffs snapped tightly around my wrists, biting sharply into my skin as they ratcheted the locking mechanism shut. "Secure the suspect," the lead officer shouted unnecessarily, keeping his weapon trained on my head, even though I was completely immobilized. From my vantage point pressed against the floor, I watched Kendrick execute a flawless, sickeningly perfect theatrical performance. He remained on his knees, rocking back and forth, staring at the incapacitated mercenaries, and then at me with wide, horrified eyes. She went completely insane. Kendrick gasped out, his voice shaking with artificial trauma. Chief Miller, I thought she was going to kill me. She had a massive psychotic break. She attacked my private security team with broken glass. Look at what she did to them. She is completely out of her mind. Chief Miller, a heavy-set man with a thick gray mustache and a uniform adorned with gold commendation stars, holstered his weapon and immediately rushed to Kendrick's side. He did not secure the crime scene. He did not question why a civilian hedge fund manager had a team of heavily armed, undocumented tactical mercenaries bleeding on his office floor. He did not ask me for a statement or read me my Miranda rights. He acted exactly like a highly paid employee, tending to his wealthiest employer. Mr. Chairman, you are safe now, Chief Miller said soothingly, placing a comforting hand on Kendrick's tailored shoulder. We received the silent alarm from your panic room. We knew her mental health was deteriorating based on the wellness check reports from last night. We have an emergency psychiatric transport unit waiting outside just like you requested. You do not have to worry about a thing. We are going to take her away and process the involuntary commitment paperwork immediately. The absolute sickening reality of their corruption hung heavy in the air. The local police department was functioning as Kendrick's personal abduction squad. They were willfully ignoring the shattered coffee table, the blood, and the professional-grade weapons scattered across the room. They were going to drag me out the back door, strap me to a gurney, and lock me inside a padded room in a private, unlisted psychiatric facility before the sun even came up. They were handing Kendrick the exact outcome he had purchased with his philanthropic donations. Chief Miller turned his attention back to me, his expression twisting into a mask of disgust. "Get her up," he ordered the officers, pinning me down. "Drag her out through the service entrance. We are not parading a violent psychiatric patient through the front doors where the neighbors might see. The chairman has a reputation to uphold." The two officers hauled me roughly to my feet, gripping my biceps with bruising force. They forced me to my knees again, keeping me completely subservient and positioned directly in front of Kendrick's desk. Kendrick slowly stood up. He brushed the dust from his expensive charcoal slacks. The performance of the terrified victim was instantly discarded the moment the police secured the room. He stepped forward, walking right up to where I was kneeling in the glass and blood. Chief Miller politely stepped back, giving the billionaire unfettered access to his restrained, helpless prey. Kendrick looked down at me. His handsome, perfectly sculpted face was a mask of pure, unadulterated triumph. He leaned in close, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of my own adrenaline. He lowered his head until his mouth was inches from my ear, ensuring the corrupt police officers could not hear his final gloating whisper. "I told you that you were standing in a burning building." Kendrick breathed, his voice vibrating with malicious, arrogant joy. "But you forgot who actually owns the fire department in this city. You played a very good game tonight. You fight like a demon. But physical strength means absolutely nothing against real power. I am going to erase your entire existence. By tomorrow morning, you will be heavily sedated in a locked ward, my son will be exclusively mine, and I will be drinking champagne on a private island. You lose." He pulled back, offering me a wide, victorious smile that showcased his pristine white teeth. He stood tall, waiting for my spirit to finally break, waiting for the tears of absolute despair to fall, now that I was completely trapped by the corrupt system he controlled. I looked up at him. I did not struggle against the heavy steel handcuffs biting into my wrists. I did not look at the corrupt police officers standing guard around the room. I looked directly into the deep, arrogant eyes of the man who thought he had just won the war. I let the silence stretch for a fraction of a second, feeling the quiet, rhythmic vibration of the ultra-low frequency transmitter still resting safely inside my combat boot. I tilted my head slightly. And then, kneeling on the ruined floor of his office surrounded by his paid enforcers, I smiled. I smiled. It was not a smile of surrender. It was the cold, calculating expression of a predator watching a snare snap shut around its prey. The corrupt officers gripping my arms shifted uneasily, instinctively disturbed by a reaction that completely defied the helpless victim narrative they had been paid to expect. Kendrick recoiled slightly, his perfectly manicured eyebrows pulling together in a frown. The sight of my amusement infuriated him. He straightened his spine and violently smoothed the lapels of his ruined expensive suit jacket. He looked down at me, his chest puffing out as he delivered what he believed was his ultimate winning declaration. "In this city, my money is the law," Kendrick stated, his voice ringing with absolute unchecked arrogance. "You are done." I tilted my head back, meeting his furious gaze with absolute deadpan calm. "True," I replied, my voice slicing clearly through the heavy silence of the ruined study. "But your money evaporated exactly 5 minutes ago." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy as an executioner blade. Chief Miller let out a harsh, dismissive scoff, adjusting the heavy utility belt at his waist. "Keep your mouth shut," Miller barked, gripping his service weapon. "You are going to a locked ward. Save your crazy stories for the doctors." But Kendrick did not scoff. His eyes darted instantly to the shattered remains of his master control tablet lying uselessly against the far wall. The memory of that massive flashing red federal error code was still burning a hole in his brain. His bravado flickered, replaced by a sudden sickening wave of nausea. He took a hesitant step back, his breathing suddenly shallow. "What did you do?" Kendrick demanded, his voice dropping into a frantic, reedy whisper. He ignored the police chief entirely, stepping closer to me again. "Tell me what you did to my accounts." I let out a low, dark chuckle. "I told you, Kendrick. I am not the woman who cries when you raise your voice. I am the woman who burns your empire to the ground. That $200 million offshore wire transfer you scheduled for 4 o'clock did not bounce to the Cayman Islands. I rerouted the entire payload into a secure holding account monitored directly by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Kendrick stopped breathing. The color drained from his face so fast he looked translucent. And I did not stop there. I continued, my voice rising slightly, projecting absolute authority over the entire room. "I dumped the raw, unedited ledgers of your massive Ponzi scheme onto the desk of every major enforcement director at the Securities and Exchange Commission. I handed them the routing numbers you used to launder extortion cash for the cartels. I gave them the passenger manifest for the private charter flight you booked to escape tonight. I gave them everything. You are completely bankrupt, Kendrick. Your bank accounts are frozen solid. Your pristine reputation is currently being shredded by federal prosecutors. You do not have a single dime left to pay these corrupt cops to drag me out of here." Chief Miller frowned, a sudden uneasy shadow crossing his heavy features. He looked at Kendrick, expecting the billionaire to immediately shut down my wild accusations with a confident wave of his hand. But Kendrick was physically trembling. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of his mahogany desk. He grabbed his secondary smartphone from his jacket pocket with his uninjured hand. His fingers were shaking so violently he could barely unlock the screen. "Mr. Chairman," Chief Miller said, his voice losing a fraction of its previous certainty. "What is she talking about?" Kendrick did not answer. He was frantically refreshing his banking applications. I watched the absolute terror consume him in real time. Every single application returned the exact same catastrophic result. Access denied, federal hold, account frozen. His thumbs tapped the screen with desperate manic energy, trying to reach his private wealth managers, his offshore fixers, anyone who could tell him this was just a glitch. The calls failed to connect. The jamming devices the mercenaries had activated earlier were working perfectly, trapping him inside a digital blackout of his own making. "Turn off the jammers!" Kendrick screamed at the incapacitated mercenary bleeding on the floor. "Turn off the signal jammers right now. I need to make a call." The mercenary groaned, clutching his shattered arm, entirely incapable of following the order. Chief Miller took a slow step forward. The corrupt police chief was not a smart man, but he possessed the base survival instinct of a rat on a sinking ship. He recognized the smell of genuine terminal panic. He looked at the heavily armed, undocumented mercenaries bleeding on the floor. He looked at the shattered biometric glass. And then He looked at the billionaire who was supposed to fund his retirement, currently hyperventilating and clawing at his own collar. Kendrick Miller said, dropping the respectful title completely. Are your funds actually frozen? Because if you cannot cover the transfer we agreed on for tonight, I cannot take the risk of transporting her. Do your job, Kendrick roared, turning his hysterical rage toward the police chief. I own you. I own this entire department. Arrest her. Drag her out of my house. I smiled again, feeling the heavy steel handcuffs biting into my wrists. It was a beautiful, poetic collapse. The loyalty he thought he purchased was instantly dissolving the second the money vanished. He cannot pay you, Chief Miller, I stated calmly, addressing the police officer directly. And you are currently standing inside a primary federal crime scene. If you try to drag me out of here, you will be charged with kidnapping, aiding and abetting a known fugitive, and conspiracy to commit financial fraud. The feds already have the data logs showing how much dirty money Kendrick funneled into your union pension. You have about 90 seconds to decide if you want to die in a federal penitentiary for a man who is completely broke. The officers holding my shoulders exchanged nervous, frantic glances. They loosened their grip just a fraction of an inch. The absolute authority in my voice, combined with Kendrick's undeniable meltdown, was rapidly eroding their chain of command. Shut up! Kendrick shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. He lunged toward me, raising his foot to deliver a vicious kick to my ribs. He was completely out of his mind, driven mad by the total destruction of his ego and his wealth. Before his expensive shoe could connect with my side, a low, rhythmic vibration began to shake the floorboards beneath my knees. It was not the ambient hum of the smart house systems. It was a heavy, kinetic thumping that rattled the crystal decanters on the ruined desk. The water in the remaining glasses began to ripple violently. The noise grew louder, rapidly escalating into a deafening mechanical roar. It sounded like a massive freight train was descending directly onto the roof of the estate. Chief Miller looked up at the ceiling, his eyes wide with sudden primal dread. The corrupt officers backed away from me entirely, their hands instinctively dropping to their holstered weapons. The blinding red and blue lights of their patrol cruisers outside were suddenly eclipsed by the blinding, sweeping spotlight of a tactical helicopter hovering mere feet above the property. The federal hammer had arrived. The countdown was officially over. I took a deep, steadying breath, relishing the look of absolute soul-crushing despair that finally settled over Kendrick's face. The hunter was about to become the prey. The deafening roar of the helicopter blades shook the dust from the vaulted mahogany ceilings. The intense kinetic vibration rattled the crystal decanters on the desk and vibrated through the floorboards. Before Chief Miller could even issue a command to his panicked, corrupt officers, the massive reinforced oak front doors of the estate were blown completely off their hinges. A concussive tactical breech blast rocked the entire main floor, followed instantly by the blinding strobe of heavy weapon-mounted lasers cutting through the sudden cloud of smoke and plaster. Federal Bureau of Investigation, drop your weapons right now. Get your faces on the ground. Dozens of heavily armored federal agents flooded the grand foyer like a relentless tidal wave of black Kevlar and tactical precision. They spilled into the ruined study, completely overwhelming the space in a matter of seconds. Chief Miller did not hesitate. He dropped his service weapon as if the metal had suddenly caught fire. He fell hard to his knees, lacing his thick, trembling fingers behind his head. The other 4 local officers followed suit, instantly their false bravado and purchased loyalty evaporating entirely in the face of absolute, overwhelming federal force. The FBI agents moved with terrifying efficiency. Within seconds, the local police were aggressively disarmed, zip-tied and pressed face down onto the hardwood floor right next to the bleeding mercenaries they had previously ignored. Kendrick stumbled backward until his spine hit his expensive bookshelf. He raised his uninjured hand to shield his eyes from the blinding tactical lights sweeping across the room. His chest heaved with erratic, terrified gasps. He looked exactly like a cornered rat trapped in a maze he could no longer control. Through the sea of armored federal agents, a familiar figure strode calmly into the study. Declan wore a sharp, tailored dark wool coat, his expression completely detached and rigorously professional. He held a thick stack of legal documents in his right hand. He stepped over a groaning mercenary and walked directly toward me. A tactical agent immediately knelt beside me, producing a heavy pair of bolt cutters to sever the steel handcuffs biting into my wrists. I rubbed my raw skin, standing up slowly to my full height, feeling the absolute intoxicating rush of complete victory. The fragile, terrified housewife act was permanently retired. Kendrick Declan announced, his voice carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of federal authority. I am executing a federal arrest warrant authorized by the United States Department of Justice. You are being charged with wire fraud, massive financial extortion, money laundering for international syndicates, and attempting to flee federal jurisdiction. Kendrick shook his head frantically, his eyes darting around the ruined room in a desperate search for an exit that did not exist. You have no proof, he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. This is a massive misunderstanding. I am a respected investor. She is completely crazy. She attacked my private security team unprovoked. I walked over to his mahogany desk and picked up his secondary smartphone from where he had dropped it. I tapped the screen, accessing the smart home interface he thought he exclusively controlled. I did not just send your financial ledgers to the federal government, Kendrick, I stated coldly, holding his terrified gaze. I brought an audience to verify your character. I tapped a single command on the interface. The massive 80-inch flat-screen television mounted on the far wall of the study suddenly flared to life with a brilliant flash of light. The high-definition display did not show a breaking news broadcast or a blank security feed. It showed a high-level, highly secure video conference call. The grid on the screen was populated by dozens of very angry, very powerful individuals. I recognized the faces immediately. The enforcement directors of the Securities and Exchange Commission sat in their pristine offices. A panel of federal prosecutors leaned close to their cameras, and interspersed among the strict government officials were the faces of the billionaire investors from the gala, including Harrison Cole and Richard Montgomery. The screen split cleanly in half. On the right side, the live feed of the disgusted, furious investors stared back at us. On the left side, a crystal-clear, high-definition video began to play. It was the internal security footage from this very study captured by the hidden cameras Kendrick himself had installed to secretly monitor his staff. But the feed had not been wiped or destroyed. I had bypassed his localized server and mirrored the camera data directly to an external, heavily encrypted cloud the moment I breached his firewall. The video played the exact moment from 10 minutes ago. The audio was pristine. Kendrick's voice boomed through the high-end surround sound speakers of his own office. Break both her legs. Do it right now. Break her legs and make her fix this. The footage showed the brutal close-quarters combat that followed, highlighting every single desperate, violent command Kendrick issued while he cowered behind his hired guns. The billionaires on the screen watched in absolute horrified silence as the man who had just promised them massive returns ordered the physical mutilation of a woman he believed to be his defenseless wife. I looked at Kendrick. The remaining blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickening ashen gray. He stared at the massive television screen, his jaw hanging completely slack. He was watching his entire carefully constructed philanthropic elite persona disintegrate in front of the exact people whose money and respect he worshipped. They had seen the monster. They had seen the coward. I hacked your internal camera grid the moment I breached your server, I explained, stepping closer to him so he could hear every single syllable clearly over the noise of the idling helicopter outside. I set up a secure encrypted live stream. When I tapped the distress signal in my boot, it did not just alert the FBI tactical teams. It sent automated priority invitations to your entire high-net-worth client list and the federal regulatory boards. They have been watching this room live for the past 20 minutes. They watched you admit to your financial crimes. They watched you order your mercenaries to cripple a woman. Harrison Cole leaned into his camera on the video feed, his face twisted with pure disgust. You are a dead man in this industry, Kendrick. You will never touch another dime as long as you live. You are not just going to prison, I whispered, delivering the final crushing blow to his shattered ego. You are going to be remembered by the entire financial world as a violent, pathetic fraud who got outsmarted and dismantled by the woman he thought was nothing." Kendrick let out a low, agonizing sound. It was not a scream of rage or a shout of defiance. It was the final broken whimper of a man whose soul had just been completely crushed into dust. His knees buckled instantly. He slid down the mahogany bookshelf, collapsing onto the hardwood floor in a pathetic, trembling heap. He pulled his knees tightly to his chest, hiding his face in his uninjured hand, completely broken and utterly destroyed. The master manipulator had been entirely dismantled, and the federal agents stepped forward to drag what was left of him away in chains. 4 days passed since the federal tactical teams dragged Kendrick out of his ruined suburban fortress. The ensuing media firestorm was absolute and merciless. Every major financial news network ran continuous 24-hour coverage of the spectacular collapse of his hedge fund. He was denied bail. He was sitting in a high-security federal holding facility wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, completely stripped of his tailored suits and his purchased influence. I was back in my own element. The executive suite of my private security firm occupied the entire 50th floor of a downtown high-rise. The space was sleek, austere, and heavily fortified with bulletproof glass overlooking the Chicago skyline. I was seated behind my minimalist slate desk, reviewing the final extraction reports with Declan, when the heavy acoustic doors of my office violently burst open. The interruption was so sudden that Declan instinctively dropped his hand to his concealed holster. But it was not a corporate threat. It was my mother. Linda stumbled into my office, shoving past my highly trained receptionist, who had been trying to politely intercept her. The sight of my mother was genuinely jarring. The pristine diamond-draped society matron who had aggressively cornered me at the financial gala just days ago had completely vanished. She looked like a woman who had just survived a catastrophic shipwreck. Her expensive designer coat was deeply wrinkled and buttoned unevenly. Her perfectly highlighted hair hung in a frantic, tangled mess around her face. Deep, dark bags circled her eyes, and streaks of ruined mascara stained her pale, trembling cheeks. "Blair," she gasped, her voice cracking into a raw, desperate wheeze. She stumbled forward, practically collapsing into one of the leather guest chairs opposite my desk. She dropped her expensive handbag onto the floor, ignoring the contents spilling across the rug. I did not stand up. I did not offer her a glass of water. I simply leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together, and fixed her with a cold, analytical stare. Declan took one look at my face and silently stepped back into the shadows near the door, allowing me to handle the incoming wreckage. "What do you want, Mother?" I asked, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. Linda leaned forward, burying her face in her trembling hands. She let out a loud, pathetic sob that echoed harshly in the quiet, professional space. "The feds took everything," she wailed, her words slurring together in a panic. "They froze my accounts. They locked the doors to the house. I tried to use my debit card this morning to buy coffee, and it was declined. The bank teller told me my entire financial portfolio is under active federal seizure." I maintained my rigid, emotionless posture. I already knew exactly what she had done. When my cyber division ripped through Kendrick's master ledgers, we found the complete list of his active investors. Linda was sitting right near the top of the pyramid. "You invested in his offshore expansion fund," I stated, laying out the brutal facts with clinical precision. Linda nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a terrifying, absolute desperation. "He promised me a guaranteed 30% return by the end of the fiscal year. He told me it was an exclusive friends and family opportunity. I wanted to secure my retirement. I wanted to make sure I never had to worry about money again." "And how exactly did you fund that investment?" I asked, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You do not have that kind of liquid capital just sitting in a checking account." She choked on a fresh wave of sobs, clutching the arms of the leather chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I mortgaged the house," she confessed, her voice dropping to a shameful whisper. "I took out a massive second mortgage on the estate. I liquidated my entire pension plan. I cashed out the life insurance policy your father left me. I gave Kendrick every single cent I had in the world. I wired it directly into his holding account last week. And now the government says it was all a giant fraud. They say the money is completely gone, and they are seizing my house to pay off the institutional creditors. I have 24 hours to pack my things before the marshals lock the doors permanently. I have absolutely nothing left. And now, standing in the ashes of her own phenomenal greed, she dared to invoke the concept of family loyalty. I placed my hands flat on the smooth surface of my slate desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout. I delivered my verdict with the chilling absolute finality of a judge reading a death sentence. 4 days ago, I reminded her, my eyes locking onto hers with unyielding force. 4 days ago, you called my encrypted phone at 2 in the morning. My twin sister was bleeding on my floor with 3 shattered ribs, and you used that phone call to tell me that Kendrick was the pinnacle of an elite businessman. You told me he was an incredible provider. You told me that I was a massive disappointment, that I dressed like a mercenary, and that I had absolutely no idea how to be a real woman. Linda froze. The frantic tears stopped flowing, replaced by a sudden sickening realization of exactly where she was sitting. Then I continued, my voice growing even colder. You cornered me in a bathroom at a high society gala. You raised your hand to slap me across the face because you thought I was risking his bank accounts. You actively defended a domestic abuser because he bought your designer dresses and paid your mortgage. Blair, please, she begged, her voice shrinking into a pathetic squeak. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I did not know. You knew exactly who he was, I countered, slicing through her pathetic excuses. You just did not care as long as the checks cleared. You made your choice. You chose the money, and you chose the monster. I leaned back in my executive chair, breaking eye contact to look out at the sprawling Chicago skyline. You once told me Kendrick was the perfect man, and I was a massive disappointment, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. Now you can move under a bridge and embrace that absolute perfection. Linda let out a loud, devastated wail. She dropped to her knees right there in my office, reaching out to grab the edge of my desk. No, you cannot do this to your own mother. You cannot just throw me out into the street. I will die out there. You have to give me something. Just a loan. Just a place to sleep. I did not even look at her. I reached out and pressed the silver intercom button on my console. Security, I said clearly. We have a hostile trespasser in the executive suite. Send an extraction team immediately to remove her from the premises. Do not allow her to return to this floor. Within 10 seconds, 2 massive, highly trained corporate security guards entered my office. They did not hesitate. They grabbed my mother by the arms, hauling her roughly to her feet. Linda thrashed and screamed, her voice echoing violently down the sleek corporate hallway as they dragged her backward toward the elevator banks. Blair, you cannot do this. I am your mother. You owe me. Her shrieks grew fainter as the heavy elevator doors slid shut, sealing her fate completely. The silence rapidly returned to my office, pristine and undisturbed. I picked up my pen, pulled the extraction reports back toward me, and went back to work. The federal indictment against Kendrick moved through the justice system with a speed rarely seen in white-collar crime. He had committed the cardinal sin of high society. He did not just steal money. He stole it from billionaires who possessed the political leverage to ensure he was prosecuted to the absolute fullest extent of the law. His high-priced boutique defense attorneys dropped him the exact second his retaining fees bounced. He was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who took one look at the undeniable mountain of digital evidence, the unredacted ledgers, and the high-definition video of his violent assault, and immediately advised him to plead guilty. He was sentenced to 35 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. He went from a sprawling $15 million suburban fortress to an 8-by-10 concrete cell. While the federal government systematically dismantled his fraudulent hedge fund to repay the institutional creditors, Declan turned his ruthless legal expertise toward the family court system. The divorce proceedings were a complete and total slaughter. We did not just want Brianna to be free, we wanted her to be absolutely untouchable. The judge assigned to the custody hearing reviewed the footage of Kendrick ordering his armed mercenaries to break a woman's legs. The emergency ex parte motion Kendrick had originally filed to have Brianna committed to a psychiatric ward was entered into the public record as evidence of severe calculated and malicious domestic abuse. The corrupt boutique psychiatrist who signed off on that fake evaluation was stripped of his medical license and placed under federal investigation for criminal conspiracy. Brianna was granted permanent, irrevocable sole physical and legal custody of her son Leo. Kendrick was stripped of all parental rights. He was legally barred from ever contacting the boy again. But Declan and I were not finished. We initiated a brutal surgical civil litigation campaign targeting every single clean asset Kendrick possessed before he launched his Ponzi scheme. The federal authorities seized the dirty money, but the legitimate properties, the clean trust funds, and the initial capital he had accumulated legally were entirely exposed. We sued him for severe emotional distress, domestic battery, and extreme financial abuse. The civil court judge awarded Brianna everything. She took the luxury cars, the clean investment portfolios, and the remaining equity in the seized properties. We bled the monster completely dry to ensure his victim would never have to worry about financial survival for the rest of her natural life. The transformation in my twin sister over the next 6 months was nothing short of miraculous. The physical wounds healed. Her shattered ribs knit back together. The deep purple bruising faded from her cheekbone, leaving behind a flawless complexion. But the internal healing was the true victory. She took the clean settlement money and bought a beautiful, modest home in a quiet, heavily wooded neighborhood, far away from the toxic, superficial elite circles of Chicago. I personally designed and installed a state-of-the-art military-grade security system for her new property, but she did not live in fear anymore. She stopped wearing the heavy, restrictive designer silk dresses Kendrick had forced upon her. She started wearing comfortable clothes. She laughed freely. She enrolled in a university degree program, reclaiming the career ambitions her abuser had violently suppressed. Most importantly, Leo was safe. He was growing up in a house filled with warmth, genuine affection, and stability, completely shielded from the narcissistic, violent rage of his biological father. Brianna was no longer the trembling, dependent trophy wife cowering in a dark foyer. She was a fierce, independent mother, raising her son with the kind of unconditional love our own mother was entirely incapable of providing. I stood in the center of my executive office on the 50th floor, bathed in the cool blue light of the late afternoon. The heavy rain beat a chaotic rhythm against the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof glass. I held a steaming mug of black coffee looking out over the sprawling metallic skyline of downtown Chicago. The city looked beautiful and dangerous, a labyrinth of steel and glass where predators hid in tailored suits and prey suffered in silent, luxurious cages. But the predators in this city had learned a very harsh, unforgettable lesson. They had learned that there are forces operating in the shadows far more dangerous than money. They learned that absolute power is an illusion that can be shattered by a single string of microscopic code and a highly trained operative willing to cross the line. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the headlights of the traffic far below blend into a river of white and red. I thought about the men who build their empires on the broken spirits of the women they claim to love. I thought about the abusers who hide behind wealth, corruption, and the false security of a locked door. They rely entirely on fear. They expect silence. They expect us to break. Never mistake the quiet patience of a woman for weakness. We observe. We calculate. We map the exact architecture of your defenses while you are busy telling us how powerless we are. And when you finally push us into a dark corner, when you force our backs against a cold marble wall and threaten the people we love, we do not cower. We do not cry. We do not beg for mercy. We dismantle your entire reality. We tear your fraudulent empires down to the absolute bedrock, and we leave you rotting in the ashes of your own arrogance. We destroy you. If this story resonated with you, Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice survival and women who refuse to be victims. Remember that your strength is your ultimate weapon, and you are never as trapped as they want you to believe. Thank you for watching and stay safe out there. The chilling narrative of dismantling a fraudulent, abusive empire to save a sister leaves us with a profound realization about power illusion and the true definition of family. Society frequently equates extreme wealth and high society status with invincibility, conditioning victims to feel entirely trapped. Abusers rely heavily on this illusion, weaponizing financial control, systemic corruption, and social isolation to build their domestic cages. They constantly mistake a woman's quiet endurance for permanent weakness. However, the ultimate lesson here is that no fortress of abuse is truly impenetrable when met with unyielding courage, tactical intellect, and fierce sisterly loyalty. Furthermore, the devastating betrayal by the enabling mother serves as a crucial, albeit painful, awakening. Shared DNA does not automatically guarantee love, protection, or loyalty. When blood relatives prioritize materialistic lifestyles, designer clothes, and superficial prestige over your physical safety and basic human dignity, severing those toxic ties is not an act of cruelty. It is a necessary act of absolute self-preservation. Setting ironclad boundaries is the first and most critical step toward reclaiming your life. Family should be a sanctuary of mutual respect, not a sacrificial altar for someone else's insatiable greed. Ultimately, this story teaches us that victims of manipulation and violence are never as powerless as their tormentors desperately want them to believe. Real power does not come from intimidating the vulnerable or hiding behind bank accounts. True strength is forged in the shadows of survival. It is about taking back your own narrative, transforming your deepest scars into impenetrable armor, and fighting back with cold, calculated precision. We must stand together fiercely, protect those who cannot protect themselves, and completely destroy the systems that enable domestic abuse. If you believe in standing up against toxic abusers and fighting for the people you truly love, hit the like button, share your own thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more empowering stories of survival and absolute justice.